It was the middle of October when I finally decided to take a break from everything and head to a small cabin I'd rented through a local listing. It was deep in the northern part of Michigan, near the edge of the Hiawatha National Forest. I'd found the place online, and it looked quiet, simple, and most importantly, far away from everyone and everything. That's what I needed: space and silence. Work had been eating me alive for months. I was behind on deadlines, barely sleeping, and felt like I was on the edge of a breakdown. This wasn't some emotional outburst or drama. I just needed to get away, breathe some fresh air, and reset. The cabin was cheap, too, because it was far off the beaten path and had no internet or phone service. That was a bonus for me. I drove up on a Tuesday morning. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the wind had that sharp edge to it that meant winter was close. The drive was long, almost 8 hours, and the last hour was on a single-lane dirt road that wound through thick woods. Trees closed in on both sides, and I didn't see another car for miles. It was the kind of place you go if you don't want to be found. When I got to the cabin, I felt a little relieved. It was exactly as described. A small square building with a slanted metal roof, a front porch with 2 wooden chairs, and a big stack of firewood next to the door. No frills, no charm, just simple and solid. I unpacked everything from my car and brought it inside. There was a bedroom, a living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. Everything smelled like old wood and dust. The air inside was cold, so I built a fire, and within an hour it was warm and comfortable. The first night was peaceful. I read a bit from a book I'd brought, made some canned soup on the gas stove, and fell asleep around 10. It was so quiet outside I could hear the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The next morning, I woke up feeling better than I had in weeks. I went for a walk along one of the trails behind the cabin. The forest was thick, full of pine and birch, and the ground was soft with old leaves. I walked for about an hour and never saw a single person. I liked that. I liked being completely alone out there. By the third day, I started to notice something strange. Not scary, just odd. I'd leave things in certain places, and they'd be slightly moved when I came back. My flashlight was on the kitchen counter one night and on the table the next morning. A pair of socks I'd left near the fireplace were on the bed. I figured I was just tired and forgetful. I didn't think too much of it. But then I found the footprints. It was raining a little on the 5th morning. The ground outside was soft with mud. When I stepped out onto the porch to get more firewood, I saw them, clear footprints leading from the trees to the front steps. Bare feet, long, narrow toes. Not mine. They came from the woods and stopped at the porch. There were no prints going back. I stood there for a long time, just staring. I didn't want to believe what I was looking at. Maybe they were old, I thought. Maybe they'd been there before I got here, and the rain made them show up again. But they were sharp and fresh-looking, and there were no other signs of animal prints or other human tracks. I brought the wood inside and locked the door. I stayed inside that day, barely moving from the couch. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have. I kept checking the windows, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. By nightfall, I had convinced myself that it had to be a mistake. The mind plays tricks when you're isolated for too long. The 6th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. Not from inside, but outside, near the back of the cabin. It sounded like slow, steady footsteps crunching through the leaves. They circled around the cabin once. I held my breath, sitting up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. Then the sound stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but it never came back. The next morning, I walked outside with a hatchet in my hand. The back side of the cabin had clear footprints in the mud again, bare feet walking in a circle. No shoes. No animal could do that. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and decided to leave. I didn't even make coffee. I tossed everything in my trunk and backed out of the narrow driveway. I drove fast down the dirt road, tires slipping in the mud, hands gripping the steering wheel hard. About 5 miles from the cabin, I saw a man standing in the woods. He wasn't walking or moving, just standing there, maybe 30 feet from the road, watching my car go by. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just pants, and his skin looked pale, almost gray. His hair was long and wet, like he'd been standing in the rain all night. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. When I got back to the main road, I didn't pull over until I was in a gas station parking lot 40 miles away. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I thought I did. I didn't call the cops. What was I supposed to tell them? That someone was walking around barefoot in the woods? For weeks after, I kept checking news reports from that area. I never saw anything. No missing persons, no weird activity, nothing. It's like he was never there. I've never gone back to that part of Michigan. I never will. I don't know who he was or why he was there. I just know that sometimes, in places like that, you run into people who don't want to be found. And if you're lucky, they'll let you leave. I got lucky. I don't usually take vacations alone, but last fall, I needed one. Things at work had been overwhelming, and I'd just gotten out of a long, dragging relationship that left me mentally drained. I wanted to be away from people, from noise, from the usual routines. Somewhere quiet, somewhere simple. I found a small listing online for a private cabin in northern Wisconsin. It was tucked behind a closed-down gravel pit about 15 minutes off the main highway. The place was described as rustic, no Wi-Fi, no TV, and no neighbors nearby. That sounded perfect to me. I booked it for 7 days. When I arrived, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. The drive up to the cabin was long, bumpy, and lined with thick woods. The gravel pit had a collapsed chain-link fence and old, rusted machinery sinking into weeds. Past that, the road narrowed to little more than a path. The cabin finally came into view after a sharp curve. It was small and square, made of dark brown logs with a steep green roof. A screened-in porch stretched along the front. The windows were dusty but intact, and the chimney on the far side looked solid. It wasn't a fancy place, but it looked safe enough. I parked beside it and unloaded my gear. Inside, it smelled like old pine and stone. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a twin bed with a thick wool blanket, and a narrow counter with a propane stove and sink. A metal water tank sat in the back. There was no bathroom inside, just an outhouse about 20 yards away through a gap in the trees. I had brought everything I needed: canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, firewood, a flashlight, and a big battery-powered lantern. I also had a hunting knife, bear spray, and a whistle, standard stuff when you're off the grid. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some beans, read a few chapters of a paperback I brought, then climbed into bed. The silence out there was deep and clean, like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. I felt myself relax in a way I hadn't in months. The next day, I explored the area. Behind the cabin, the land dropped into a wide basin filled with gravel piles, dead grass, and tire tracks that had faded over time. The pit was huge. I figured it had been active years ago and then just left alone. There were a few rusted trailers and half-buried machines in one corner, but I didn't go near them. Something about them felt forgotten, like they were better left untouched. I spent the afternoon walking the trails through the woods. There were deer tracks, fallen trees, and big patches of ferns. The air was cool, but the sun kept it from feeling cold. By late afternoon, I headed back, made a small fire in the stove, and fixed myself a simple dinner. That night, I heard something. It was maybe an hour after I laid down. At first, I thought it was wind moving through the trees, but then I heard a thud. Not loud, but heavy, like someone had dropped a thick log onto the ground. I sat up and listened. Nothing else, just that single thud, then quiet. I waited maybe 10 minutes, then laid back down. The woods are always making sounds, I told myself. Probably a deer or a branch falling. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place. The firewood pile was undisturbed. No prints in the soft dirt. I walked out to the edge of the gravel pit and looked down at the scattered equipment. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the sound. It had felt closer than the pit, maybe just behind the cabin. I told myself not to overthink it. Day 3 was colder. The sky stayed gray all day, and the wind picked up. I stayed near the cabin, gathering extra firewood from the edge of the pit. I found an old shovel sticking out of a bush. The handle was cracked and the metal was rusted over, but it looked like someone had tried using it recently. The dirt around it had been disturbed. I didn't like that. That night, the sound came again. This time it was 2 thuds, closer and more definite. Then, maybe 30 seconds later, something scraped against the porch. A long, dragging scrape. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it out the front window. I couldn't see anything. My heart was racing. I held still for what felt like an hour, waiting to hear something else. But it stayed quiet. The next morning, I found something odd on the porch. A line, like someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal across the boards from one end to the other. I followed it to the steps, but it just stopped there. No footprints, no marks in the dirt. I looked around the cabin again, but saw nothing else strange. By day 4, the feeling had changed. I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I felt watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like something was just beyond the trees, still and quiet, just looking. I kept the bear spray on me at all times and started locking the cabin door even when I was inside. I didn't go far that day. I mostly stayed indoors, trying to stay warm and distracted. I read, cooked, wrote in my journal. But even inside, I kept glancing at the windows. Couldn't help it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed with the lantern on low. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. This time, it was a tap on the glass. One soft tap on the back window. I froze. The bed was right under that window. I didn't move for 5 full minutes. Then I turned off the lantern, grabbed my flashlight, and slid slowly off the bed onto the floor. I crawled across the room and peeked out the front window. I couldn't see anything. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave early. I still had 3 days left on my rental, but something wasn't right. I started packing my gear and loading the car. I planned to leave by noon. That's when I noticed the shed. It was partly hidden behind a clump of trees on the far side of the gravel pit. I hadn't seen it before. It was a small structure, maybe 8 by 10 feet, made of mismatched boards with a slanted tin roof. Something about it made me uneasy. I stood for a long time just staring at it. I should have left then, but I didn't. I decided to go check it out. I told myself it would give me peace of mind, just to see what was inside before I left. I walked around the pit down a narrow trail that led to it. The door was slightly open, like someone had forgotten to latch it. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The shed was empty except for a metal table, some plastic buckets, and what looked like torn-up tarps in the corner. The air inside smelled like damp wood and something sour like old meat. I backed out quickly and walked straight back to the cabin. That was enough. I was done. When I got to the cabin, the front door was open. I knew I had locked it before I left. I had the keys in my pocket. I stood there for a second, heart pounding. Then I walked inside. Nothing looked touched. My bag was where I left it. The bed was made. The lantern was still on the table. But the back window, the one over the bed, was unlocked. I hadn't opened it once the whole time I was there. I slammed it shut and locked it again. I grabbed my keys, threw the rest of my gear into the car without checking it, and got out of there. I drove fast, barely slowing down as I hit bumps and curves. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop until I hit the next town. I booked a cheap motel, showered for the first time in days, and stayed up all night with the lights on. My hands shook for hours. When I got home, I emailed the rental company and told them I left early. I didn't explain why. They didn't ask. A few weeks later, the listing for the cabin disappeared. I tried to forget about it. I really did. But a few months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I did some digging. The gravel pit had been shut down in the early 2000s. Before that, there were a few small buildings nearby for storage and maintenance. One of them had been used as a break room by the workers. It burned down in 2005 after someone left a space heater on overnight. 2 men were sleeping in there. One got out, the other didn't. No arrests, no lawsuits, just a short mention in a local paper. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I felt out there, but something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe someone was using the cabin or the pit without permission. Maybe it was nothing, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt, and I'll never go back. It started with a simple plan. I was 39, recently divorced, and just needed space. No phones, no emails, no one asking me for anything. I'd rented a cabin up in northern Michigan for 2 weeks. It was early September, the kind of time when the summer crowd dies down and the leaves haven't started to change yet. Everything feels still and quiet in those woods. The cabin was off a rough gravel road, about 6 miles from the nearest paved one. I had to drive slow to avoid tearing up my tires. When I finally pulled in, the cabin looked smaller than the pictures. It was a single-story wooden place, faded red paint, with a wide porch and one rocking chair. There was no other house in sight. The trees surrounded it tight, and behind the cabin was a drop-off into a thick ravine. You couldn't see past the tree line in any direction. The first day went fine. I unpacked, cooked some pasta, and spent the evening sitting out on the porch, listening to crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep you don't get in a city. The second day, I woke early. I hiked around the trails behind the cabin. Most weren't marked, but I followed what looked like deer paths and took my time. No one else was out there. That's what I wanted. I came back in the late afternoon, sweaty and sore. I rinsed off with the outdoor hose, since the water heater inside didn't seem to work right. Cold but refreshing. That night, I ate a can of chili and sat on the porch again. Just quiet. By the third day, something felt off. I can't explain it well. Just a feeling like someone was around. Not watching me exactly, more like I wasn't alone. It got stronger when I was inside the cabin. Outside, it didn't bother me. But indoors, I kept glancing at the windows and listening for sounds that didn't happen. I chalked it up to nerves. I tried to brush it off. I made myself a fire in the little wood stove, read a book I'd brought. The unease didn't go away, though. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing what I thought was a footstep on the porch, just 1 or 2 steps, like someone shifting their weight. Every time I went to look, there was nothing. The rocking chair moved slightly once, but maybe it was wind. Day 4, I hiked further down the ravine. The path I took was steep and rough. I ended up slipping near the bottom and scraping up my leg pretty bad on a rock. It was bleeding enough that I wrapped it in my shirt and hobbled back. It took me nearly an hour, and I was sweating and dizzy by the time I made it to the cabin. I cleaned the cut with some vodka I had and wrapped it in gauze from a little first aid kit. It looked okay. Hurt like hell, though. That night, something knocked on the wall. Not the door, the wall. It was around 2 a.m. I'd been trying to sleep again, and I was wide awake when I heard 3 sharp knocks, not like an animal thumping around. These were spaced out and deliberate. I froze, waited, nothing. I stayed in bed for what felt like an hour before I fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. No footprints, no damage, no signs anyone had been there. Still, I didn't feel safe. I decided I'd cut the trip short and leave the next morning. I didn't want to pack in the dark and risk getting stuck on the rough road at night. I tried to take it easy that day. I read, wrote in a little notebook, watched birds, ate peanut butter on crackers. By dusk, I double-checked that all the windows were locked and propped a chair against the door for good measure. I kept the hatchet from the woodpile inside with me. Around midnight, I woke up again. I didn't know why at first, but I had that full-body alertness that only happens when something's wrong. I sat up. There were no knocks this time, no sounds outside, nothing, but it was the silence that felt wrong. No crickets, no wind, just a dead quiet that pressed in through the windows. Then I noticed the back door was open. I know I locked it. I remember turning the bolt before bed. The door was slightly ajar, just enough that I could see the darkness beyond it. I sat there frozen for what felt like 10 minutes. Finally, I stood, grabbed the hatchet, and approached the door. I pushed it shut and locked it again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. The first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I stuffed it all into the back of my car and didn't even eat breakfast. I wanted to get on the road and not look back. About 3 miles down the gravel road, I found the first tire trap. Someone had laid a board with nails sticking up right across the path. I slammed the brakes just in time. I got out, dragged it into the woods, and checked my tires. Somehow, I'd missed all the nails. I kept going. A mile later, there was another one. This time I was going slower and saw it in time. Same thing, a board with nails. Someone had planned this. They'd set them where the trees were thickest and the light was lowest. I didn't like thinking about what might have happened if I'd run over them. I tossed the second board deep into the trees and drove slower. When I hit the paved road, I almost cried. I didn't stop driving until I hit a small town an hour away and parked at a gas station. I sat there for a long time. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I say? Someone scared me in the woods? Someone opened my door and knocked on the walls? Laid boards with nails? I had no proof, no pictures, nothing. Still, I called the rental owner and told him the water heater wasn't working, and I left early because of that. He refunded me a couple days' worth. I didn't mention the rest. It's been months since that trip. I haven't been camping again. I haven't even gone into the woods. I've had my locks changed and added cameras around my house. I still don't know what exactly happened at that cabin. Maybe it was a drifter. Maybe someone knew I was there alone. Maybe they were trying to scare me, or maybe they were waiting for me to leave the cabin unlocked again. What really keeps me up some nights is that silence I heard. That heavy, wrong kind of quiet that doesn't happen in the wild. Like even the animals knew something was out there. I tell myself I got out in time. I left before anything worse could happen. And maybe that's true. But I still think about how that door was open. How someone had to be standing just outside while I was asleep. Maybe even inside. I don't think I'll ever really know how close I came to something terrible. But I know I won't ever go back to a cabin in the woods again. Not alone. Not ever. I rented a small cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho in late September. I had been burned out from work and needed a break from everything. Phones, emails, people, traffic. The listing said the cabin was remote, quiet, surrounded by forest, and without cell reception. That sounded perfect to me. I packed enough food and water for a week, brought some books, a sleeping bag, some gear, and left early in the morning to avoid traffic. The drive took about 6 hours. The first part was normal highway, but as I got deeper into the forest, the roads narrowed. The last stretch was just a gravel road that seemed more like an old logging path. I kept driving until the trees started to close in around the car. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, just one room and a loft, made of dark wood with a metal roof. There was a fire pit out front and a small deck. No other cabins or houses nearby. It felt completely cut off from the world. I unpacked my gear and looked around. The forest behind the cabin was dense, tall pines and spruces everywhere. The air smelled clean and sharp, like pine and cold earth. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent the first few hours just walking around the property, checking out the trails that led off into the woods, and stacking some firewood from the small shed behind the cabin. The first night was peaceful. I cooked on the small propane stove, read a little, and went to bed early. The quiet was almost too quiet, but I figured I'd get used to it. On the second day, I hiked a few miles down one of the trails. It eventually looped back, and I returned around late afternoon. Nothing strange happened, but I did get the odd feeling a few times that I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination. That kind of stuff happens when you're alone in the woods. That night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch outside, like a footstep on dry leaves. I sat up and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything else. But then there it was again, a slow, deliberate step. Then another. I got up and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black outside, and I didn't want to turn on a light and ruin my night vision. I stood there for a while listening, but the sound stopped. I eventually went back to bed. The next morning, I looked around the cabin. There were no animal tracks, No sign of anyone being there. I figured it might have been a deer or something. Still, I was more alert the rest of the day. I didn't go hiking again. I just stayed near the cabin, reading and keeping the fire going. That night, the sounds came back. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard what sounded like breathing outside the window, deep and slow. I didn't move. I just sat up in bed and listened. It was right on the other side of the wall. Then it stopped. I waited for a long time before I even moved. I didn't go outside. I just stayed in the cabin, holding a hatchet I kept for chopping wood. I barely slept. In the morning, I checked around the cabin again. Still nothing, but I noticed something weird. One of the firewood stacks I had neatly arranged the day before had been knocked over. Not scattered, just tipped over like someone had shoved it. That didn't feel like a deer. By now, I was uneasy. I thought maybe someone had followed me out here. I started double-checking the doors and windows. I had no cell signal and no landline. I had no way of calling for help unless I drove 20 miles back down the mountain. On the fourth night, things escalated. Around midnight, I woke up to banging. Not loud, more like someone tapping slowly on the wall. First on one side of the cabin, then another. It moved around, tapping once or twice, then silence, then again from another direction. I got up, axe in hand, and sat in the middle of the cabin, just listening. I stayed up all night. When the sun came up, I went outside. Nothing, but I saw footprints this time. Human footprints, barefoot, in the dirt around the side of the cabin. I followed them a few feet into the woods, but they just stopped. No trail, no more prints, just gone. That's when I knew for sure that someone was messing with me. I packed my things. I was done. I didn't want to stay another night. I loaded the car and locked the cabin just out of habit. I started the engine, but it didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood, but I'm not great with cars. Everything looked normal. Nothing leaking, no obvious problems. I was stuck. I grabbed my pack, filled it with food, water, and the axe, and started walking back down the road. I knew I wouldn't make it to the highway before dark, but I just wanted to get closer to help. After about 2 hours, I heard a vehicle coming. I stepped into the trees to flag it down, but what came wasn't a car. It was an old truck, slowly rolling down the road with no lights. I stayed hidden. The truck passed, and I saw a man inside. He looked normal, but something about the way he was staring straight ahead, not looking at the road, gave me a bad feeling. He wasn't searching. He was patrolling, like he knew someone was out there. I waited a long time after he passed before I got back on the road. I kept walking, fast, and didn't stop until the sun went down. I made a small camp just off the road and slept lightly, axe close by. The next morning, I got lucky. A forest ranger came by in a pickup truck. I stepped out and flagged him down. He looked surprised to see me. I told him my car had broken down and that I'd been walking for help. I didn't mention the cabin or the man in the truck. He drove me to the ranger station, and from there I got a ride to a nearby town where I could call for a tow. When the mechanic went up to retrieve my car, he said it started just fine. No issues. Battery was good. Nothing wrong with it. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't leave a review. I just moved on and tried to forget it. But I still think about those barefoot prints and the man in the truck. I don't know what he was doing out there or why he was circling that road at night, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. Whatever was going on in those woods, I think it was meant to scare people off. Or worse, I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never anywhere I can't get out of by sundown. I had never been one to shy away from the idea of a solo getaway. The thought of getting away from the noise of the city and retreating to a cabin in the woods felt like a refreshing change. I wasn't one of those people who feared isolation or the quiet of nature. If anything, I relished the idea. So, when I found a cabin for rent in a secluded area a few hours north of the city, it seemed perfect. The cabin was tucked away in a dense patch of forest, far enough from any nearby towns that I would have no distractions. I'd read through the description of the place online. No cell service, no internet, just pure silence. It seemed ideal for a break from everything. There was a small, winding dirt road leading to it, and the surrounding trees looked dense enough to block out most of the sky. The drive out had been peaceful. The world around me seemed to grow quieter as I left the hustle of the city behind. There were no cars on the road, just the occasional deer or squirrel darting across. The air grew cooler, the trees taller, and the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel was the only thing I could hear. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I could see how isolated it truly was. It was a small structure, made of rough-hewn logs with a steep roof, almost as though it had been dropped there by time itself. There was no sign of anyone else around. The cabin was nestled against a hill, and the only road leading in seemed to be the one I'd just driven down. A small porch wrapped around the front, and there was an old rocking chair resting in the corner, the kind you'd expect to see on a grandma's porch, but I was the only one here. I could tell it had been a while since anyone had visited. It wasn't run down, but the place had that feeling of abandonment, of having been left alone to age naturally with no need for upkeep. After getting my bags out of the car and unlocking the front door, I stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and pine. It was cozy but sparse, just the essentials. A fireplace sat in one corner, and a small kitchen area was to the left. There was a single bedroom with a small bed and a tiny bathroom. I set my things down and took a deep breath, letting the peaceful solitude of the place sink in. The silence was comforting, almost as though it was wrapping around me, keeping me protected from the rest of the world. I didn't have any plans for that night. My intention was to just relax, maybe read, cook a simple meal, and enjoy the calm. It wasn't until I was unpacking my things that I noticed something strange. On the floor, near the door, there was a thick layer of dust, except for a small section that had been disturbed. The marks were deep, as though something or someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. I couldn't imagine how it could have happened. Maybe the cleaning crew missed it, or maybe it had been done by animals, though it didn't make sense for an animal to leave those kinds of marks. I shrugged it off. I had no reason to think anything strange was going on. The cabin had just been unused for a while, and I was the first one here in weeks, maybe even longer. I decided to go outside and explore a bit, since the weather was good. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in orange and purple hues. There was a trail leading through the trees at the back of the cabin, so I grabbed my jacket and set off, eager to stretch my legs after the long drive. The forest around me felt quiet, even more so than the cabin itself. The trail wasn't particularly well marked, but it seemed to wind its way through the trees and along the ridge. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air as I walked. I noticed the leaves on the ground, yellowing with the changing season, and the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were all I could hear. I had a sense of being watched, but it was more of an instinctive feeling, one that was just a part of being in the woods. I walked for a good half hour before turning around. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the shadows were starting to lengthen. By the time I made it back to the cabin, night had fully set in. I was eager to get inside, light the fire, and settle in for the evening. Inside, I made myself a simple dinner of pasta and salad, and ate it quietly, enjoying the solitude. Afterward, I sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, its warmth chasing away the chill of the evening air. I felt completely at ease. The peace I'd been craving was finally mine. But as the night went on, the silence started to feel heavier. There were no sounds outside, no night animals, no breeze rustling the trees. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is about to happen. I tried to ignore the feeling, tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't a logical fear. It wasn't that something specific seemed off. It was just this nagging sense of discomfort. I kept glancing at the windows, but there was nothing outside except darkness. I tried to relax, to read, to watch the fire, but my mind kept drifting. And then I heard it, a soft thud. It came from somewhere outside, just beyond the walls of the cabin. I froze. It was so quiet that I thought I must have imagined it. But then I heard it again, another soft thud. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something heavier, something that didn't belong in the natural rhythm of the forest. I stood up, my heart beating faster. I walked over to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain to peer outside. The yard was empty, the trees shrouded in darkness. The only movement was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Nothing. I tried to calm myself down. I must have heard a branch fall or something moving in the brush, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it. It was just a gut feeling that something was wrong. The next hour passed in strange, creeping tension. I couldn't bring myself to go to bed, so I stayed in the living room, watching the fire and listening to the silence. The thuds stopped, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like there was something out there in the dark, just waiting for me to turn my back. Around midnight, I finally decided to call it a night. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and made sure everything was secure before heading to the bedroom. I tried to sleep, but the silence was unbearable. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wood, made me jump. The fear that had started earlier that evening had settled deep in my chest. I managed to sleep for a few hours, but it wasn't restful. When I woke up, it was still dark, and the feeling of being watched was even stronger. Couldn't shake it. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, of what might have caused those strange sounds. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. The cabin that had once felt so welcoming now seemed claustrophobic, oppressive. The walls felt too thin. The silence felt too heavy. I spent the next day trying to push through the unease. I went on another hike, trying to distract myself, but the woods felt different now. Every rustling leaf made me look over my shoulder. Every distant sound felt like it was closer than it should be. Couldn't relax. The peaceful retreat I had come for had turned into a prison. That night, I decided I had enough. I would leave the next morning. But as I went to lock the door one last time, I noticed something. The marks on the floor near the entrance were deeper now, as if something had been dragged across the cabin again. I didn't stay long enough to investigate. I grabbed my bags, left the cabin, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I returned to the city that I realized how stupid I had been. I thought about what could have happened if I'd stayed another night, if I had ignored that growing sense of dread. I never found out who or what was responsible for the noises or the marks on the floor. But I learned something important that night. There's a difference between isolation and being alone. And sometimes, being alone is exactly what you should fear. It started as a break from work. I'd been feeling burnt out for months, stuck behind a desk for long hours and barely sleeping at night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not friends, not family. I just picked a spot on the map that was far from any city or town, somewhere deep in the forested parts of northern Michigan. I rented a small off-grid cabin online. No phone service, no internet. That was the draw. I packed enough supplies to last 2 weeks. Canned food, dry goods, bottled water, some basic tools, a few books, and a hand crank radio. I brought a sleeping bag even though the cabin had a cot. Something about the idea of being completely self-sufficient made the whole trip feel like more of a reset than a vacation. I even brought a small solar panel setup for emergencies, but planned to mostly live without power. The drive took about 12 hours. As I got deeper into the woods, the roads got narrower and rougher. It was the kind of place where GPS stops working and you have to rely on printed directions. I followed the directions exactly, turning off a gravel road onto what looked like a logging path. The trees were tall and close together, and the sun barely touched the ground in some places. Eventually, I saw a faded wooden sign nailed to a tree that said, Cedar Ridge Cabin. That was it. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove in the corner, a cot against one wall, a small table and chair, and shelves lined with jars, pots, and old tools. There was an outhouse about 50 feet behind the cabin and a small stream nearby for washing up. Everything looked old but well kept. There was no dust or cobwebs, no animal droppings. Someone had been maintaining it. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I woke up with the sun and spent the mornings hiking or sitting by the stream. I read books in the afternoon and made simple meals on the wood stove. At night, I lit candles and listened to the wind outside or the occasional sound of a deer or raccoon moving through the woods. It felt like I was finally alone with my thoughts. For the first time in years, I could breathe. It wasn't until the fifth night that something felt off. I woke up around 2 a.m., unsure what had stirred me. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Usually, I could hear the wind in the trees or small animals rustling. But that night, it was like the whole forest had gone still. I stayed in my sleeping bag and tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next day, I went about my routine but with a strange feeling in my chest, like something was watching me. I shook it off as paranoia. Too many city years had made me soft, but the feeling stayed. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the trees. At one point, I thought I saw movement between two trunks, but when I walked over, nothing was there, just silence. That night, I decided to stay inside. I double-checked the door latch, even though it was just a simple wooden bar that slid into place. I kept the hatchet by the cot. I told myself it was just to be safe. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps outside. Not animal sounds. Human footsteps, crunching the dry leaves and twigs. Slow and steady, they stopped right outside the cabin. I held my breath. Then I heard the soft creak of the front step. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say a word, just stood there. I stayed still, listening. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in the cot, gripping the hatchet and staring at the door. In the morning, I went outside and checked the area. No footprints, but the ground was covered in leaves, so it was hard to tell. I told myself it had to be an animal, even though I knew the difference. The days that followed were tense. I stopped hiking. I kept my ears open at all times. I started noticing things out of place. Once, the wood pile was shifted. Another time, a jar on the shelf had moved. Small things, but I remembered exactly how I'd left them. One morning, I found the outhouse door swinging open when I knew I had closed it the night before. By the 10th day, I was done. I packed up everything and decided to leave early. But when I got to my car, the driver's side window was smashed in. Nothing was stolen, but the battery had been disconnected. I reconnected it, praying it would still start. It did. I didn't waste time. I left that place and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in a small town about 6 hours south. I stayed in a cheap motel that night just to get some sleep. It was only then that I noticed the scratches. On the back of my car, deep near the trunk, there were 5 long scratch marks, like fingers, spread wide apart, too wide for any human hand. But they weren't claw marks either. They looked like someone had dragged a dull blade across the paint in 5 long streaks. I reported it to the local sheriff the next morning. He listened, nodded, said he'd heard strange things from people who'd been out near Cedar Ridge. But he didn't write anything down. He didn't ask for my name, just told me to get home safe and not to go back there. I haven't. I don't talk about it much either. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear footsteps outside. But it's just a dream. At least that's what I tell myself. If there's one thing I learned from that trip, it's that we aren't always alone, even when we think we are. And the woods don't have to be haunted to be dangerous. Sometimes people go out there for reasons that have nothing to do with nature. And sometimes they don't want to be found. I got lucky. I left before anything worse happened. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I'm not going back to find out. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I needed a break from the chaos of work, the constant noise of the city, and the endless bombardment of thoughts in my head. A small cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I'd booked it online, finding it through a site that specialized in rustic retreats. The pictures showed a cozy, old-fashioned cabin, nestled deep in a forest, far from civilization. It looked like the kind of place where I could disconnect, read a few books, and maybe do a little hiking if the weather allowed. No internet, no cell service, just me and nature. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The road, mostly dirt and gravel, wound through dense woods. Every time I passed a turnoff or a little clearing, I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn, but the GPS assured me I was heading in the right direction. The trees grew taller as I ventured deeper into the forest. The silence around me grew thicker, more profound, with every mile I covered. The air smelled earthy, damp, and fresh. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool breeze wash over me. It was peaceful. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos, if not a little more weathered. The wood on the exterior was faded. The roof looked like it had seen better days, but it was solid. The small porch had a swing, and the front door was a bit crooked but sturdy. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was exactly what I needed. I unloaded my things, making sure to bring in the few essentials I thought I'd need. A couple of books, some food, a flashlight, and a first aid kit just in case. I had no intention of going far into the woods immediately. First, I wanted to settle in, get comfortable. The interior of the cabin was exactly what I imagined. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, and the walls were adorned with old, faded wallpaper. There was a fireplace on the far wall, which I planned to use later that evening, and a small kitchen area with a table and 2 chairs. A few chairs were scattered around the space, and the large window in the back gave a perfect view of the forest behind the cabin. It was charming despite its age, and it felt like it was far removed from the modern world. There was no rush, no deadlines, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It was serene. After a few hours of settling in, I decided to take a walk. I grabbed my jacket, locked the door behind me, and stepped out into the woods. The trail, barely visible, wound around the cabin and led further into the trees. I wasn't in any rush, so I walked slowly, taking in the silence. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots and the occasional creak of trees in the wind. It was almost unnerving in its quietness, but it wasn't threatening. It was just isolated. I must have walked for nearly an hour before I started to feel the first signs of unease. There was no real reason for it. The forest was beautiful, peaceful even, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the usual tranquil feeling I'd hoped for. Maybe it was the feeling of being watched, or maybe it was just the emptiness of the place. I couldn't explain it. The trees were so dense, I couldn't see very far in front of me. Every time the wind shifted, the branches above me swayed and creaked, and every time I heard an animal rustling in the bushes, I flinched. Still, I pushed forward, telling myself it was just nerves, just the unfamiliarity of being so far removed from the world. I decided to head back to the cabin. The walk back felt longer than the one out, and by the time I reached the clearing, I was feeling a little more on edge. I shook it off. I was overthinking it. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and turned on the small lamp by the couch. I lit the fire in the fireplace and made myself a cup of tea. That night, I spent hours reading by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't a tangible fear. There was nothing specific to be afraid of. The cabin was perfectly safe, and the woods outside, while eerie, weren't dangerous. Still, something lingered in the back of my mind. I thought about leaving, but I knew that wasn't necessary. I was being foolish. Eventually, I went to bed, pulling the thick blankets over me, trying to drown out the strange noises of the forest. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, and the occasional thud or creak of the cabin seemed louder than usual. I turned over, trying to ignore it, but then I heard it. Footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't the soft padding of paws. It was heavy, the sound of boots, or something like them, crunching the leaves and twigs outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I could hear them moving closer, until they stopped right outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anything from the bed, and I didn't want to make a sound. My mind raced, trying to think of a logical explanation. Maybe it was just another hiker, lost or looking for help. But what if it wasn't? What if someone was out there with bad intentions? I lay there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, listening to the footsteps continue their slow march around the cabin. Finally, after what seemed like forever, they stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. I waited for what felt like hours, but no other sounds came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just an animal or the wind. Maybe I was hearing things, but sleep didn't come. Every creak, every rustle, kept me awake, and I eventually drifted into a restless slumber. Morning came and I was exhausted. The sun filtered through the cracks in the curtains, and the soft light of dawn bathed the cabin in a warm glow. I decided to get up early to shake off the tension that had built up overnight. I made some breakfast, eggs and toast, and tried to focus on the day ahead. But the feeling of unease still lingered. I tried to push it aside and went outside to gather some wood for the fire. As I stepped out the front door, I noticed something strange. The area around the cabin was undisturbed, but just a few feet from the door, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A set of boot prints, fresh in the soft dirt. And they weren't just a random pattern, they were heading straight toward the cabin. They circled it, the same path I had heard the night before. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I had thought it was just my imagination, but the prints were real. They were fresh. Someone had been outside the cabin, walking around it just like I'd heard. Panic surged in me. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here, not knowing who or what had been out there. I grabbed my things, rushed to lock the door behind me, and made my way to the car. But as I opened the door, I hesitated. Was it safe to drive out? What if whoever it was still out there, watching? What if they were waiting for me to leave? I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by fear. But then I made up my mind. I had to leave. I wasn't going to risk it. I got in the car and drove away, watching the cabin disappear behind me, feeling the weight of the tension lift as I put miles between myself and that place. In the end, I didn't stay at the cabin the full weekend. I drove back home, shaken but safe. And though I still don't know who or what was outside that cabin that night, I've never gone back. I don't think I ever will, but I'll never forget the way the woods felt. Quiet, watching, and full of a kind of silence that no one should have to face alone. I had never stayed in a cabin alone before. I wasn't nervous about it, just focused. I needed a break from everything. Work had me stressed out all year. My apartment lease was ending, and I didn't feel like looking for a new place just yet. So I figured I'd take a month, maybe two, and disappear for a bit. Reset. I had some money saved, and when a guy I knew from an old hiking forum offered to rent me his cabin up north, I said yes without even visiting it first. He gave me the GPS coordinates, told me there was a locked gate I'd have to open about 6 miles down a logging road, and warned me the cabin didn't have cell reception. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my SUV with everything I could think of. 2 coolers full of food, 2 water jugs, propane for cooking, my rifle, my camera, a pile of old books, and more tools than I'd probably need. The weather was cold but dry, early October. Still enough light in the evenings to make use of the days. I set out on a Tuesday morning and drove north for hours until paved roads turned to gravel, and gravel roads turned to something barely recognizable as a road at all. By the time I reached the logging road he mentioned, I had only seen 1 car in the last hour. It was exactly what I wanted. The gate was old but not rusted shut. I unlocked it using the key he gave me, drove through, then got out to chain it shut again. After that, the forest swallowed the road. Trees bent overhead, pine needles blanketed the trail, and the air felt cold even with the windows up. It was quiet, not peaceful quiet, still quiet, heavy. I remember that feeling even now, like the air had weight. There weren't even birds singing. The road wound slowly up a shallow slope, sometimes steep, sometimes flat. I drove carefully. Fallen branches littered the way, and deep ruts threatened to grab the tires if I wasn't paying attention. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trail opened into a small clearing. The cabin stood at the far edge, backed by dense trees. It was older than I expected, with a metal roof, a long covered porch, and small windows on all sides. Smoke-blackened stones circled a fire pit out front. It looked used, but not recently. I parked beside the cabin, stretched my legs, and took it all in. The place smelled like pine, wet moss, and cold air. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the dim inside. It was one big room with a loft above. A wood stove sat in the corner, a kitchen on the other side, and a ladder led to the sleeping area. It was clean. No signs of mice, no mold. It was better than I expected. Over the next few hours, I unloaded my things, stocked the shelves, tested the propane burner, and lit the stove to take the chill off. There was no electricity, but the solar-powered lanterns worked fine. The outhouse was a short walk down a trail out back. That first night, I sat by the fire outside, sipping hot tea, watching the stars, and feeling like I'd made the right call. It was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Nothing but wind in the trees and the crackle of flames. But that stillness never quite left. I noticed it again the next morning when I walked the perimeter of the clearing. There were no birds. I didn't hear a single one. I chalked it up to the season. Maybe they'd migrated already. Maybe it was just too cold. Still, the forest felt heavy. Not dangerous. Not yet. Just watchful. For the next few days, I settled into a rhythm. I'd wake up at sunrise, cook a simple breakfast, chop firewood, then hike the old logging trails. I kept track of the sun with a pocket watch and always made sure I was back before dark. I didn't want to get lost out here, especially with no signal. I saw a few deer, lots of old tracks in the mud, but never anything living. No other people, no fresh tire marks at the gate. The quiet became normal, even comforting, until about a week in. That morning started like the others. Cold, gray light through the trees, breath hanging in the air, frost on the cabin windows. I made coffee, ate some canned beans, and planned to explore a fork in the road I hadn't gone down yet. It veered east, toward the mountains, and I figured it might lead to a stream or some decent views. I packed a small bag, left a note for myself in case I got turned around, and set out on foot. That trail was rough. It hadn't been used in years. Trees had fallen across it in places, and I had to climb over deadfall and duck under branches. The forest changed as I got deeper, tighter, darker, quieter somehow. Around midday, I reached a small hill and climbed it, thinking I might get a look at the valley. At the top, I found something strange. A campsite. It was old, at least a few seasons. A ring of stones marked where a fire had burned, and beside it lay a metal pot, half buried in pine needles. There was a tarp nailed between two trees, sagging with leaves. I crouched and poked around. No backpack, no food wrappers, no personal items. Just the fire ring, the tarp, and the pot. And something else. Scratches in the bark of the nearby trees. Deep ones. Too high for a person to make without climbing. Too thin for an axe. Claw marks. 3 in a row. Always the same pattern. At first I thought bear, but something about them looked off. Clean, deliberate. I took a few photos, made a note of the location, and started back. I didn't like the feeling there. The air was heavy again, thicker than usual. I didn't hear anything, but I felt like something was nearby, watching, following. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, knocking branches against the roof. Every creak in the cabin made me tense. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just wind, just the forest. But I couldn't shake the image of those marks in the bark. The next few days were uneventful, but I noticed changes. Subtle ones. Things in the cabin weren't quite where I left them. A flashlight that had been on the shelf was on the counter. The axe leaned against the porch instead of hanging on the nail. I told myself I was forgetting things, slipping. Living alone in silence plays tricks on you. But part of me wasn't convinced. Then one morning I stepped outside and found prints in the frost. Not boot prints, bare feet, human feet, thin, long toes. Not deep enough to be fresh, but fresh enough to see. They led from the edge of the clearing to the fire pit, then back into the woods. I didn't hike that day. I stayed inside, cleaned the rifle, checked every lock on the windows and doors. I sat by the stove with my back to the wall, watching the trees through the glass. Nothing moved. No birds, no deer, nothing. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Steps. Slow ones. Not animal. Deliberate. Something heavy, moving outside on the porch. I killed the lantern and waited in the dark. I held my breath. I heard the steps stop near the door. Then nothing. Just silence. I waited until daylight before checking. Nothing was there. No prints. No scratches. But the axe was gone. The nail was empty. I decided I'd leave the next day. I packed what I could that night, loaded it into the SUV, and left just enough out for breakfast. I planned to drive out at sunrise. The gate wasn't locked from the inside, so it'd be a straight shot back to the highway. I felt sick, like I was being watched even while I packed. That night, I heard it again. The steps. Closer this time. Slower. They circled the cabin. I stayed still, clutching the rifle in the loft, not daring to move. At one point, I swear I heard breathing. Low. Just under the window. Then it was gone. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was enough light to see, I ran out to the SUV. The tires were slashed. All four. Deep cuts in the sidewalls. Clean. Precise. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows. I went back inside and locked the door. I had no radio. No signal. No way out. I stayed calm, made a plan. I'd hike out. It was 20 miles back to the highway. Maybe more. But I could do it if I packed light. I left the note again, just in case someone found the cabin after me. I started walking just before noon. I took only what I needed: water, some food, my rifle, and a flashlight. The air was cold and the trees darker than before. Every sound made me jump. I walked fast, didn't stop. Around 4 p.m., I saw movement ahead. Something ducked off the trail. I didn't see what, just motion. A blur of dark shape disappearing behind a tree. I froze, listened. Nothing. I kept going. Faster. No stopping. No resting. When I reached the gate, the chain was gone. The lock too. Just the post and the road stretching beyond. I stepped through without even thinking. But I never made it to the highway. About a mile past the gate, I saw smoke. A small fire, just off the road. Someone was there. I stepped carefully, staying behind. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything and rent a cabin for a few weeks. I had been working long hours for almost a year straight. Most of it behind a screen, barely sleeping, living off takeout and coffee. I felt burned out. A friend of mine had told me about a secluded cabin in northern Wisconsin, near a place called Iron River. He had stayed there once in the winter and said it was perfect if I needed total quiet and space to reset. The cabin was about 1.5 miles off a gravel road, surrounded by dense woods. I drove there in a 4-wheel drive SUV I borrowed from my brother because my little car wouldn't have made it down the path. There were no neighbors in sight, and the trees were just starting to turn yellow and orange. The air smelled like pine and dry leaves, and the silence was almost too thick at first. But I welcomed it. The cabin was small and old, but solid. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a little kitchen with a propane stove, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. No Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any phone signal. I brought books, a deck of cards, a notebook, and some groceries to last me a while. I thought the first few days would be hard without all the noise I was used to, but it felt natural. The nights were cool and quiet except for crickets and the occasional owl. I spent my days walking the trails that wound through the trees and my nights reading or writing. The place was peaceful, and I started sleeping better than I had in years. I'd wake up around sunrise and fall asleep not long after dark. Felt like I was slowly sinking back up with time. On the 4th night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but enough to snap me out of sleep. It sounded like something brushed up against the outside wall of the cabin. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it happened again the next night. A soft thump, then a scratching sound. I got up and checked outside with a flashlight, but saw nothing. The trees swayed gently, and everything smelled damp. I told myself I was being paranoid, but over the next few nights, the sounds didn't stop. One night, I heard what I thought was a low, muffled cough. Not an animal noise, but something distinctly human. I froze in bed, holding my breath, listening so hard my head hurt. I didn't hear it again that night, but the next day I noticed something strange. Around the back of the cabin, near the window, I saw what looked like the faint impression of a shoe print in the dirt. Not deep, but clear enough to make out the sole pattern. It hadn't rained, so it must have been from someone walking near the cabin fairly recently. I started locking the doors more carefully. I kept the firewood stacked closer, and I even dragged a few logs up onto the porch, just to have them handy. I found myself looking out the windows more often. I even started carrying the axe when I went outside, though I didn't really expect to use it. One morning, I noticed something else. A piece of red cloth was hanging from a branch about 30 yards behind the cabin. It looked like a torn piece of shirt or maybe a bandana. It hadn't been there before. I checked the area and didn't find anything else. But the trees were dense, and it would have been easy for someone to hide if they didn't want to be seen. I took the cloth down and burned it in the stove. After that, I started hearing things in the early mornings, too. Just before dawn, I'd sometimes hear a soft crunch of leaves or a stick snapping. I'd lie there, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to come closer, but it never did. I started to feel watched, like I wasn't alone out there. I considered packing up and heading home early, but a part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I wasn't sure if someone was messing with me, or if my mind was playing tricks on me out there in the isolation. I decided to stay one more week, but promised myself I'd leave at the first sign of real danger. 2 nights before I was supposed to leave, I stayed up later than usual, sitting near the stove, reading. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, clear, deliberate steps on the dry leaves. I turned off the lamp and sat still in the dark. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly. I didn't dare move. I sat there for almost an hour, clutching the axe in both hands. Eventually, the footsteps faded away into the woods. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they were clearer. I could see the shape of a boot, a bigger one than mine, probably a man's. The prints circled the cabin completely and stopped at the back window, right where I had heard the scratching before. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of the room with my back to the wall, watching the door. I didn't hear anything, but I was sure someone had been watching the cabin at night. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't care if I had 2 days left. I wanted to be out of there. As I loaded the SUV, I heard something moving in the woods. Not an animal, heavy footsteps. I didn't look. I just got in and drove, heart pounding the entire way down that narrow path. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't report anything. I didn't know who I would have reported it to. There was no real evidence, and I wasn't hurt. I just wanted to forget about it, but I couldn't. For weeks after I got back home, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about how isolated that cabin was, how someone could have been out there the whole time, watching, maybe waiting. A few months later, I read an article online. It was about a man who had been arrested in northern Wisconsin. He had been living off-grid, hiding out in the woods. They found stolen supplies, maps, and photos taken through cabin windows. One of the photos they showed in the article was of the exact cabin I stayed in. It was taken from the woods, zoomed in on the front door. The article said he had been watching multiple cabins and sneaking around at night. They didn't find any weapons on him, but they said he had a list of names and dates, maybe keeping track of who was staying where and when. That was the last time I ever went to a cabin alone. I still get out in nature, but I stay at public campgrounds now. I like hearing other people nearby, even if it means less peace and quiet. I learned that complete silence and total isolation can sometimes bring the worst kind of company. It was the end of September when I decided to take a break from everything. Life had been moving too fast. Work was drowning me. My phone never stopped buzzing, and I felt like I hadn't taken a deep breath in months. So, I booked a cabin about 4 hours from home. in a forested area that didn't show up clearly on maps. It was advertised as off-grid, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no electricity. That was the whole point. I packed basic supplies, food for a week, extra water, a flashlight, a hatchet, some tools, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife. I made sure my truck was in good shape. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just left a note for a neighbor with the name of the cabin rental and an estimate of how long I'd be gone. I was looking forward to just sitting still for once. The drive up was quiet. Once I passed the last town, the road narrowed to dirt and gravel. Trees closed in thick on both sides. It was around 4 p.m. when I reached the gate. I opened it, drove through, and shut it behind me. The cabin sat about a quarter mile down the path, nestled in a clearing. It was one story, made of rough logs, with a small porch and a metal chimney. A basic outhouse was visible near the tree line. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a bed pushed into the far corner, a small table, 2 chairs, and shelves with canned food and basic utensils. There was a hand pump near the sink for water and a stack of split wood by the stove. I dropped my bags and took a deep breath. Felt still, a good kind of still. I sat on the porch until the sun went down, listening to the forest settle. That first night was peaceful. I started a fire in the stove, ate some canned beans and bread, then lay on the bed with a book and a headlamp. It was dead quiet outside, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. The next morning, I hiked a bit around the area. The land sloped upward behind the cabin, and I found a small trail that looked rarely used. I followed it for a couple miles until it petered out near a dry creek bed. I saw no signs of people. No rappers, no old campfires, nothing. Just birds, squirrels, and the wind in the trees. I stayed out until early afternoon, then made my way back and cooked some rice and eggs on my camp stove. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was soft but sharp, like a twig snapping. Then another. It was probably just an animal, I figured. A raccoon or deer. I looked out the window but saw nothing. Still, I had trouble getting back to sleep after that. The next day was quiet again, but I started to feel like something was slightly off. I noticed scuff marks on the porch that I didn't remember seeing before. They were faint, like something heavy had been dragged. Could have been my own boots, I thought. I shook it off. I made a point of tidying up my things and keeping the doors locked. That evening, while chopping some extra firewood, I saw something strange in the trees. It was a flash of movement, low to the ground. I stared, but nothing moved again. Maybe a fox. Maybe I was just on edge. That night, I woke up again. This time, the noise was closer. It sounded like something brushing against the wall of the cabin. Then it stopped. I sat up, holding my knife, listening. For almost an hour, I sat like that, waiting for it to come back. Didn't. I eventually dozed off. The following morning, I did a slow walk around the cabin. About 30 feet from the back wall, I found tracks. They were faint but human, barefoot, wide-set. Not mine. They circled the cabin once, then vanished back into the woods. My skin went cold. I hadn't seen a soul in days. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was an old trail, someone who'd been here before. Still, I carried my knife on me the rest of the day. I didn't hike. I just stayed near the cabin, trying to stay calm. That night, I didn't sleep much. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the sound again. This time, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, walking on the porch boards. I froze. I had the knife in my hand, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I didn't move. After several minutes, I heard retreating steps. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. At sunrise, I packed. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded everything into the truck and started driving out. As I approached the gate, I noticed it was open. I had closed it. I was sure I had. That's when I saw it. Something hanging from the gate. It was a small bundle of twigs, tied with string, like a charm. I didn't touch it. I just kept driving. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only then did I pull over and breathe. I called my neighbor and told him I was coming home early. I didn't explain why. I didn't go back for a refund or to report anything. Weeks passed, and I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't explain it in a way that sounded normal. Nothing technically happened, but I felt hunted, watched, like someone had been waiting in those woods, just far enough not to be seen. I still take trips alone, but I'm more careful now. I stick to places where I know there are other people nearby. I don't go too deep into isolated woods, and I never ignore the feeling in my gut, because I don't think I was alone out there, and whoever or whatever was near that cabin wasn't just passing through. They knew I was there, and they wanted me to know they knew. The forest was eerily quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched, like the trees were holding their breath. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Away from the city, away from the noise, just me and the cabin in the woods. A little break from everything. But now, as I stood in front of the old, weathered building, a gnawing unease had already started creeping up my spine. I wasn't even sure why I felt so uneasy. I had been to places like this before, secluded cabins in the middle of nowhere, and I'd always loved it. I liked being alone. There was something calming about being completely isolated. But this cabin, there was something different about it. The first thing I noticed was how old it looked. The wood was warped, cracked in places, and the roof sagged slightly. It didn't look like it had been maintained in years. The windows were dark. Not a single light flickered from inside, and the air around the place had a strange stillness to it, the kind of stillness that made your skin itch. I shrugged off the feeling and grabbed my bags from the trunk of the car, slamming the door shut behind me. It was a bit of a hike to the cabin from the parking area, but nothing too bad, just a short, 10-minute walk through the trees. The forest was dense, the kind of woods where the light barely filtered through the thick canopy above. The path was narrow, only a faint trail through the underbrush. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, no one around for miles, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath my boots. When I finally reached the cabin, I stood for a moment just staring at it. The door was slightly ajar, not wide open, but just enough that I could see a sliver of darkness inside. My gut tightened again, but I told myself it was nothing. The place had probably just settled a little. It wasn't uncommon for old wooden buildings to shift, especially after years of neglect. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell hit me first: mold, damp wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was cold inside, despite the warm afternoon outside. The air had a chill to it, a dampness that seemed to seep into your bones. I set my bags down by the door and looked around. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft above it. A fireplace sat in the corner, surrounded by a couple of armchairs, but the hearth was empty. No wood, no signs of it being used in a long time. The wooden floor was creaky, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and dusty knickknacks. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I walked through the room, touching things as I went. There were old photographs on the walls, mostly of people I didn't recognize, and a few of what looked like the cabin when it was new, brighter, more inviting. I felt an odd pang of nostalgia as I traced the grain of the wood along the walls. It was like the cabin had a story to tell, one that I couldn't quite understand. I went upstairs to the loft. It was small, with a low ceiling that made me duck as I moved around. A bed sat in one corner, a faded quilt draped over it. There was no other furniture, just the bed, a small nightstand, and a window that looked out over the woods. I unpacked my things, putting the clothes into a small drawer and hanging a few items in the tiny closet. When I finished, I sat on the bed for a moment, just looking out the window. The woods stretched out in every direction, dark and dense. I had no cell service out here, no Wi-Fi. It was just me and nature, and the cabin. As the sun began to set, I lit a fire in the hearth, hoping to make the place feel a little less cold and lonely. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, and I leaned back in the armchair, letting the warmth soak into my skin. I hadn't realized how tense I was until I felt the tension start to ease, but then I heard it. a faint noise. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping sound coming from outside. I froze, my heart rate spiking. The wind, I thought. It had to be the wind. The trees outside creaked, their branches rubbing together. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was a scraping sound, like something was dragging along the ground. My gaze flicked to the window, but the darkness outside gave me nothing. Just the outline of trees, swaying in the breeze. I grabbed the flashlight off the table beside me and got up slowly, making my way to the door. My breath was shallow as I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I looked around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. There was nothing, no movement, just the shadows of the branches swaying in the wind. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Nothing seemed out of place. No sounds, no signs of movement. I was being ridiculous, I told myself. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me. I turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I sat back down, trying to focus on the warmth, trying to push away the unease. But it was there, creeping under my skin, making me hyper-aware of every sound. The rest of the night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels suffocating. I eventually fell asleep on the armchair, waking up a few hours later to the sound of something tapping against the window. I shot upright, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight again, pointing it toward the window, but there was nothing. The tapping stopped as quickly as it had started. My hands shook as I set the flashlight back down. It was the wind, I told myself again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I went outside to try and calm myself. I walked a bit further into the woods, just to clear my head. The birds were singing, and the sun had come out, making the whole forest feel warmer, more inviting. I kept walking, the crunch of the leaves beneath my boots the only sound. But as I walked, I started noticing something strange. The trees. They seemed to be arranged in a way that didn't make sense. Some of them looked like they had been moved, as if they had been deliberately placed in certain spots. The branches were bent at odd angles, the trunks leaning in unnatural directions. I stopped in my tracks, a cold shiver running down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn around and go back to the cabin. But when I looked behind me, the path I had walked down didn't look the same. The trees, the brush, everything was different. The trail I had been following was now hidden behind a thick wall of undergrowth. I couldn't see the cabin. Felt like I had wandered too far, but I was sure I hadn't. My gut twisted in panic. How was this possible? Where had the trail gone? I turned in a circle, my pulse racing. The woods stretched out before me, but everything felt wrong. The quiet was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made a decision. I needed to get back to the cabin. I started walking in the direction I thought I had come from, trying to push through the growing panic. But the further I walked, the more lost I felt. The trees were closing in on me, the underbrush thicker than it should have been. And then, just as I was about to break into a full run, I saw it, the cabin. It wasn't far from me, but it didn't look the same as it had before. It seemed darker, like the shadows were deeper, the walls more worn. It was as if I had been walking for hours, even though only a few minutes had passed. I stumbled toward the cabin, my breath ragged, and when I reached the door, I didn't hesitate. I rushed inside and locked it behind me. My mind was spinning. What was happening? What was going on with the woods? That night, I stayed inside, every creak of the cabin sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I stayed awake, watching the door, listening for the slightest noise. And then I heard it. A knock. It was soft, but unmistakable. Someone or something was outside the door. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to stay here another night. The next morning, I would leave, no matter what. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, I heard the sound again. The tapping. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something or someone trying to get in. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the gravel road as my truck rumbled to a stop. The cabin stood alone, nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was a modest structure, weathered wood siding, a pitched roof, and a small porch with a single rocking chair swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs after the long drive. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the cabin. Unlocking the door, I was greeted by the familiar creak of the hinges and the musty scent of aged wood. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered, simple and rustic. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by a worn leather armchair and a small bookshelf filled with dog-eared novels. The kitchen was compact, with a gas stove, a small refrigerator, and open shelves stocked with basic cookware. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. After unloading my gear, I set about making the cabin livable. I opened the windows to air out the stale interior, started a fire in the hearth to chase away the chill, and prepared a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. As night fell, the forest outside came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. I found comfort in these sounds, reminders of the untamed wilderness surrounding me. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, fishing in the stream behind the cabin, and reading by the fire. The solitude was a welcome respite from the noise and chaos of city life. Each morning, I woke to the soft light filtering through the trees, the air cool and fresh. I would brew a pot of coffee, sit on the porch, and watch as the forest came to life. On the fourth day, I decided to explore a trail I hadn't ventured down before. It was narrower than the others, overgrown with ferns and brambles, but I was eager for a new adventure. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the canopy above growing denser, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birdsong filled the air, and the scent of moss and damp earth was intoxicating. After several hours of hiking, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof partially caved in, windows shattered, and walls covered in ivy. Curiosity piqued, I approached cautiously. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Furniture overturned, debris scattered across the floor, and signs of animal habitation evident. Despite its state, there was something unsettling about the place, an air of abandonment that felt too recent. I didn't linger. As I turned to leave, I noticed a series of deep scratches on the doorframe, as if made by claws. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace back to my own cabin. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the forest, alive and indifferent, but unease settled in my gut. The following morning, I found footprints around my cabin. Large, unfamiliar prints that circled the structure before disappearing into the woods. They were too big to be human, yet too defined to be from any animal I knew. I examined them closely, noting the depth and spacing, suggesting a creature of considerable size and weight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking my every move. Determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy, I continued my routine, though my senses were heightened. Every snap of a twig, every shadow cast by the trees, set my heart racing. I began to carry a hunting knife with me at all times, its weight a small comfort. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard a noise outside, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a pair of eyes reflected the light, glowing eerily before disappearing into the shadows. I retreated indoors, bolting the door and stoking the fire higher. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the armchair, knife in hand, listening intently. The growls returned, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the cabin, as if something had slammed against the wall. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding, and backed away from the wall. The thudding continued, accompanied by scratching sounds, as if claws were raking against the wood dot. I realized I couldn't stay. At first light, I packed my belongings, loaded them into the truck, and prepared to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin, its silhouette framed by the morning sun. A sense of relief washed over me as I drove away, the forest slowly receding in the rearview mirror. Back in the city, life returned to normal. The memories of the cabin faded, replaced by the daily grind. Yet, sometimes, when the wind howls through the buildings or shadows dance across the walls, I recall those nights in the woods. I never discovered what stalked me in that forest, and perhaps it's better that way. I rented a small cabin in the woods of northern Michigan last October. I had been working long hours for months and needed a break from the city, the noise, and all the people. The cabin was listed on a local site that specialized in remote getaways. The pictures showed a rustic, wood-framed cabin surrounded by thick forest, with a small lake just a short walk away. It looked perfect, no neighbors, no traffic, no signal. I drove out there on a Friday morning. The drive took about 6 hours from Detroit. The last hour was mostly gravel roads, and the trees started closing in around me the further I went. I passed 2 other houses in that last stretch, both looked abandoned. The sun was still out when I arrived, but the shadows were already getting long. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Felt right. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but not in a bad way. There was a main room with a small kitchen on one side and a wood stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom and a single bedroom. The windows were old, the kind with the little latches that barely held. I unpacked, set up my food in the fridge, and then walked down to the lake before it got dark. The water was still, and there was a layer of mist forming on its surface. I stood there for a while just listening. Not even birds were making noise. I felt more relaxed than I had in a long time. That first night, I made a fire, cooked some pasta, and sat reading a book until the light from the stove faded. I went to bed early. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up to a scraping noise. I laid there, frozen, listening. It sounded like something moving across the wooden porch outside. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a deer. I didn't look. I forced myself to stay in bed. Eventually, it stopped, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were scratches on the bottom half of the door, like something had been pawing at it. But they weren't deep, and I figured it was just a curious animal. I brushed it off. I spent most of the day hiking a nearby trail I had found on a map in the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a faint path through the woods. I followed it for a couple miles, came across a dried-up stream, and sat there for a while. It felt good to be away from everything. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of the chairs on the porch had been moved. I thought maybe I had bumped it when I left, or maybe the wind had shifted it, but it felt off. I started locking the door, even though it felt silly being that deep in the woods. That night, I heard the scraping again. This time, it was slower, more deliberate, like someone was dragging their nails across the door. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window. I couldn't see anything. I didn't open the door. I sat there in the dark, listening. It went on for almost a minute and then stopped. The following morning, I saw more scratches, longer this time. And they weren't in a pattern that made sense. They weren't animal marks. They were more like lines. Straight, thin lines like someone had used a knife. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it could still be some kind of animal, maybe a porcupine or something else scratching for food. But deep down, I didn't buy that. I spent the day walking the perimeter around the cabin. I didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of people. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, I stacked firewood in front of the door before going to bed. It was a stupid move, but it made me feel better. I woke up at 3:12 a.m., I know because I checked my watch. There was a thud. Not on the porch this time. On the wall behind the bedroom. It was low, heavy, like someone had hit the side of the cabin with their shoulder. I didn't move. I listened. Another thud. Lower. Then silence. I sat up and turned on the flashlight. Nothing. No sounds after that. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside. There was a dent in the wall. Not big, but clear, like someone had hit it with something. I looked for tracks but found nothing. I walked down the road, back toward where I had come in. I made it about a mile before I turned back. I didn't see anything. I just felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, like something was nearby, just out of sight. That day, I kept the stove going, even though it wasn't cold. The noise helped. I started writing things down in a notebook. Times, sounds, anything strange. I wanted a record in case I needed it later. I also found a long, heavy branch and kept it inside, just in case. That night was worse. I heard the scratching again, but this time it wasn't at the front. It was along the back wall. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. Someone walked around the cabin. I turned off the lights and crouched in the corner, gripping the branch. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped, and I waited. Then came the sound of something tapping on the window glass. Tap, tap, tap. Not hard, just light enough to be deliberate. I didn't move. I stayed like that until dawn. In the morning, I went outside again. There were smudges on the glass. Not fingerprints, just marks, like someone had dragged a dirty glove or sleeve across it. I knew it wasn't in my head anymore. Someone was messing with me. I packed up everything I could. I had planned to stay a week, but I wasn't going to make it that long. I loaded the car, locked the cabin, and started driving. The road out felt longer than I remembered. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Halfway out, I saw a shape in the trees. It was tall. Still, I didn't stop. I made it to a gas station an hour away and sat there for 20 minutes. I kept thinking maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just tired, stressed, but I knew better. I never went back. I called the site where I booked the cabin and reported what happened. They said they'd look into it. A month later, the listing was gone. I don't know if someone else had the same experience or if they just pulled it down. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a ghost. It was someone who had probably been out there for a long time, watching, waiting. I think about it sometimes, how remote that place was, how easy it would be for someone to live out there and not be seen. Maybe they thought I saw something I shouldn't have. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. But whatever their reason, I'm glad I left when I did. I haven't rented a cabin since. It started as a way to get away from everything. I had taken 2 weeks off from work, something I hadn't done in years. My plan was to drive north and rent a small off-grid cabin I found on a website that listed remote vacation properties. It was in the northern part of Michigan, far from any town, surrounded by forest. No cell signal, no internet, no neighbors. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive was long, almost 9 hours. I stopped twice for gas and one more time to grab some groceries from a store near the last town on the map. It was just canned stuff, bottled water, instant coffee, and a bunch of snack foods. The directions to the cabin were printed out because I knew I wouldn't have signal past a certain point. It felt a little old school, but it made me feel better knowing I could still find the place without relying on my phone. The last stretch of the drive was on a narrow dirt road. It twisted through the forest, climbing slightly uphill, then dropping into a small valley. The trees closed in tight, brushing the sides of the car. There were moments I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn, but eventually, the road opened up a little, and there it was. The cabin was a small, one-room structure with a pitched roof, a porch, and a single chimney. There was an old shed about 10 feet behind it. No lights, no sounds, just trees and the cabin. Inside, it was rustic but clean. There was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a cot with a thin mattress, a table and chair, and some shelves stocked with basic supplies: matches, candles, a couple of lanterns, and a first aid kit. The owner had also left a few handwritten notes, instructions mostly, how to use the stove, where to refill the water jug from the rain barrel out back, and a map showing the nearby hiking trails. It felt like stepping into a different time. I spent the first 2 days hiking, reading, and sleeping. I didn't even miss my phone. I woke up early, made instant coffee over the stove, ate granola bars, and walked the trails. The woods were dense and quiet. Birds, wind through the trees, and sometimes the sound of small animals moving through the brush were all I heard. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen. It was peaceful, but on the third night, something felt off. It was cold, and the fire had burned low. I got up to add more wood, and while I was doing that, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a deer, but it didn't sound like either. It was a slow, crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. They came from behind the cabin, near the shed. I stayed frozen for a while, listening. The sound stopped. I went back to the cot, but I didn't fall asleep for a long time. I kept thinking about what it could have been. Maybe an animal, but it had sounded like a person. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, but the ground was hard and covered with leaves. I tried not to think too much of it. The next night, the same thing happened. The sound came again, footsteps behind the cabin, slow and deliberate. I lit one of the lanterns and opened the door quietly. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. The light only reached so far, and the rest of the forest was dark. I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a while, then went back inside and stayed up, sitting in the chair with the lantern on. Nothing else happened. By the fifth night, I was starting to feel uneasy all the time. I wasn't sleeping well. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. I started thinking maybe someone else knew about the cabin. Maybe a local hunter or someone who lived off-grid nearby. But if that were the case, why not say something? Why just circle the cabin at night? On the sixth day, I hiked farther than usual, trying to shake the feeling. I followed one of the trails on the map for miles until I reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was something strange. A bunch of old cans and bottles arranged in a circle, like someone had been out here drinking and then left them behind. But they weren't rusted. They looked recent. A few even had condensation on them. It looked like someone had been here very recently. That night, the footsteps came again. But this time, they didn't stop behind the cabin. I heard them go around the side, slowly, until they reached the front. I stood completely still. The lantern was on, casting shadows across the walls. The doorknob rattled once, gently, like someone was testing it. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the small hatchet that was hanging near the stove and moved to the side of the door. Nothing happened for a few minutes. Then the footsteps moved away. I opened the door fast and stepped out, the hatchet in my hand. There was nothing. I ran around the cabin, shining the lantern out into the trees, but I didn't see anything. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up my things. I had planned to stay for 2 weeks, but I was done. I didn't feel safe anymore. I double-checked that I had everything, locked the cabin as best I could, and started the drive back down the dirt road. About half a mile down, I passed a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. Parked inside, it was an old blue pickup truck. The truck wasn't running. The windows were fogged up. I stopped the car and stared at it for a while. No one was inside that I could see. I wrote down the license plate number and kept driving. When I got back to the last town, I pulled into the gas station and called the county sheriff. I told them what I had seen and gave them the license plate number. They said they'd check it out. A week later, I got a call from a deputy. He said the truck belonged to a man who had been living out in the woods for years, off the grid. He was known to the locals, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. They'd gone out to check the cabin and found signs someone had been camping near it recently. Trash, footprints, and some gear stashed in the woods. They didn't find the man. I asked if it was safe to go back. He paused, then said it was probably best to find another place next time. I agreed. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed longer. I try not to think about it, but sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps, and I'm glad I left when I did. needed to get away for a while. Everything in my life had started to feel too loud, too fast, too crowded. I was tired of hearing cars, alarms, voices, phones, everything. I was tired of the concrete and metal and blinking lights, so I rented a cabin. A real cabin, off-grid, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no traffic. Just trees, a lake, and silence. The place was about 3 hours north of where I lived, in a part of the state I'd never been to. I found it on a website that listed remote vacation rentals, mostly used by hunters, fishermen, and people who like to hike deep into the woods. I picked one that was far from the nearest town, sitting all alone at the end of a long dirt road. It was advertised as completely secluded, solar-powered, with its own well, with stove, and a small dock at a private lake. I packed simple. Food that didn't need refrigeration, 2 jugs of water in case the pump wasn't working, a few books, a lantern, and a small first aid kit. I also brought a hunting knife I'd had for years, mostly for comfort. I didn't plan to use it, but it felt like the right thing to have on me. The drive was quiet and steady. The last hour was on gravel roads that cut through thick woods. No signs, no other vehicles, just trees rising on both sides of the road and a few deer darting across now and then. My cell signal dropped out sometime during that last stretch, and I didn't mind. That was part of the reason I came. The dirt road that led to the cabin was almost invisible. If I hadn't been paying close attention to the directions I printed out, I would have missed it. There was no sign, just a break in the trees and 2 tire ruts heading into the woods. I slowed down and turned onto it, bumping over rocks and branches until I saw the cabin. It was small and square, with weathered wood siding and a rusted metal roof. A chimney stuck out from one side, and a stack of firewood was piled near the front steps. The lake was maybe 50 yards behind the cabin, through a patch of trees. The water was calm and glassy, the sky wide and clear. I didn't see any boats, docks, or houses anywhere else around the shoreline. I stepped out of my car and just stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing. No wind. No traffic. No voices. Just the soft ticking of my engine as it cooled and a few birds somewhere in the distance. Felt good. The inside of the cabin was even more basic than I expected. 1 room, mostly. A small kitchen with an old hand pump for water, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner, and a cast iron stove for heat. There were shelves with canned food, matches, a hatchet, and a flashlight. A small door in the back led to a composting toilet in a tiny closet. The windows were single pane with old wooden shutters on the outside. No locks on the doors except for a sliding bolt on the inside. I unpacked, checked the stove and water pump. They both worked fine, and then went outside to gather more firewood from the pile. I didn't plan to stay up late, but I wanted to be ready if the nights got cold. The first night passed quietly. I made a fire, read for a while, then turned off the lantern and lay in the cot listening to the woods. The dark out there was complete. No distant porch lights, no headlights, nothing. Just the shapes of trees against the stars and the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I walked down to the lake. There was a small, creaky dock with 2 old plastic chairs and a metal canoe tied to it. The air was cool, the sky gray. I sat there for a long time, watching ripples spread across the water. No one else was around. No one had been around as far as I could tell. The shorelines in both directions were empty. I spent the rest of the day hiking around the area. There were old trails that wound through the woods, mostly overgrown but still walkable. I saw deer tracks and once heard something big moving through the trees, but I never saw what it was. I kept my knife in my belt just in case, but I never took it out. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, boiled water over the stove, and ate while watching the sun go down. It got dark fast. The trees blocked most of the horizon, and once the sun dipped below the hills, the woods closed in around the cabin. I lit the lantern again and read for a while. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. It was still dark. The fire had gone out, and the room was cold. I lay there, listening, wondering if I just rolled over too fast or had a dream that startled me. Then I heard it again, a sound outside, Not close, not right outside the cabin, but close enough that I knew it wasn't a deer or raccoon. It was the sound of movement, careful movement, something stepping over dry branches or brushing against the undergrowth. A soft crack, a faint crunch, then silence again. I held my breath, straining to hear more. For a long time, there was nothing, just the usual night sounds. Insects, a distant owl, the creaking of the roof in the cold. Then it came again, closer this time, a soft shuffling sound. Then nothing. I got up slowly, moved to the window and tried to look out. It was too dark to see anything clearly, and the window glass was slightly fogged. I didn't open the shutter. I didn't want to make noise. I just stood there, frozen, eyes locked on the blackness outside. Minutes passed, no more sounds. Eventually, I went back to the cot, pulled the blanket around me, and stayed awake until the first signs of light started creeping into the window. I spent the next day trying to convince myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. The woods were full of those. But the way the sounds had stopped and started, it didn't feel right. Animals don't move like that. Not with long pauses between steps. Not that carefully. Still, I didn't want to overreact. I walked the area again in the daylight, looking for tracks. I found some deer mostly, but the ground was dry and nothing stood out. I made noise as I walked, just in case anything was nearby. I even walked all the way back up the dirt road a mile or two, to the spot where I'd first turned in, but saw nothing. That night, I made sure the door was bolted. I kept the hatchet by the cot, just in case. I didn't start a fire, didn't want the light to draw attention. I read for a bit, then turned off the lantern and listened. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was different. The footsteps were more direct, coming from the back of the cabin. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, and held my breath. They stopped. I waited. Then I heard a sound like something brushing against the wall. A soft scrape, a slight thud, then nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet in one hand and staring at the door. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight came, I went outside, walked around the cabin, and checked everything. There were no tracks, nothing out of place, no signs of an animal, no claw marks, no disturbed soil. But something had been there. I knew it. I made a decision. I didn't want to leave early. I came to be alone. But I also didn't come to be hunted. I would stay one more night. If anything happened again, I'd leave in the morning. I spent that day preparing. I made noise as I moved, chopped wood, walked the edge of the lake, hiked the trails. I wanted whatever was out there to know I was still around, still alert, that I wasn't scared. That night, I bolted the door, closed the shutters, and kept the lantern low. I didn't lie down. I sat in the chair by the door with the hatchet on my lap and the flashlight beside me. I didn't read. I didn't move. I just listened. The sounds started around 1 a.m. Slow, steady footsteps. Not on the backside of the cabin this time, on the side, near the window. Then around to the front. They stopped. For a long time, there was silence. Then I heard the doorknob move. Just a small rattle, as if someone was testing it. My blood ran cold. I stood up slowly, picked up the flashlight, and clicked it on. I moved toward the window and opened the shutter just an inch, just enough to see outside. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods. A man, far enough that I couldn't see his face, but close enough to see his shape. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching the cabin. I closed the shutter and backed away. I stood in the center of the room, not sure what to do. I didn't have a gun. My phone didn't work out here. My car was parked out front, but I'd have to unlock the door, run to it, and hope it started. I waited until first light. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door slowly and looked around. The man was gone. No tracks, no signs of movement, just quiet trees and morning air. I packed everything in 10 minutes, started the car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached pavement. The aftermath. I never went back. I emailed the owner of the cabin and told them someone had been trespassing at night. They never responded. A few had been feeling burnt out for months. My job had taken over my life. Endless deadlines, constant emails, and meetings that ran past dinner. I hadn't taken a proper break in years. So when my vacation time finally came around, I didn't want a beach, a city, or even a national park with crowds. I wanted silence, stillness. I wanted to disappear for a while, somewhere deep, somewhere far. I found the listing by accident. It wasn't even on one of the regular vacation rental sites. It was in a forum thread about old Cold War relics, decommissioned radar installations, old missile silos, and military buildings scattered across the country. A user mentioned staying in a cabin near one of those forgotten stations, nestled deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, far from the cities and even farther from cell towers. There was a link buried in their comment. I clicked on it. It brought me to a page that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. Just a few grainy photos, a short paragraph, and an email address. The cabin was small, off-grid, and located about 2 miles from an abandoned radar base that was shut down in the 1980s. It claimed to have a working wood stove, a basic bed, and a generator for lights. That was it. I booked it the same night. A week later, I packed my truck and drove north. Took me 10 hours to get there. The last part of the road wasn't even paved. My GPS gave up after a while, and I followed handwritten directions printed from an email. The dirt road leading to the cabin was long and mostly overgrown, barely a trail by the time I reached the last half mile. Trees pressed in on both sides, and pine needles covered the hood of my truck as I crept forward. The cabin finally appeared, just a dark brown shape tucked behind some birch trees. It was smaller than I expected. One level, square-shaped, with a small porch and a rusted metal chimney poking up through the roof. The windows were dusty. There was no sign of recent activity. No tire tracks, no footprints. I felt a strange knot in my stomach as I parked and killed the engine. The silence was thick. The key was under a rock near the door, just like the email said. The door creaked open and let in a rush of cold air. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood, dust, and old smoke. It was one room with a bed in one corner, a stove in another, and a single table with 2 chairs. There was a plastic tub filled with firewood near the stove. The generator was outside behind the cabin, with a long orange extension cord snaking into the wall. I brought in my bags, lit a small fire in the stove, and started unpacking. The heat built slowly, and the cabin filled with that dry warmth only a wood fire can make. I made a quick dinner, just some canned soup and crackers, and ate it while sitting by the stove. I didn't hear anything but the wind through the trees. No birds, no animals, no planes in the sky. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling into the cold. I slept early that night, exhausted from the drive. The next morning, I woke up with a start. The fire had gone out during the night, and the cabin was freezing. I wrapped myself in a blanket and got it going again, then boiled water for coffee on a small metal kettle I found on the shelf. I stood at the window and looked outside. Nothing, just trees, the dirt trail, and the sloped hill behind the cabin that rose toward where the radar base used to be. After breakfast, I decided to go see it. The path was hard to follow. It wasn't marked, and I had to rely on some rough satellite images I saved before leaving home. I walked uphill for nearly 40 minutes. The forest thinned a bit near the top, and then the trees gave way to a flat, open clearing surrounded by rusted chain link fence. The base itself was still there, sort of concrete slabs poked out of the earth like broken teeth. Some of the buildings had collapsed. Others stood with missing roofs, dark and silent. One large dome was still intact, the radar dome probably, a faded white sphere sitting on a square building with vines growing up its walls. Everything felt dead. I walked slowly, not really sure what I was looking for. I peeked into one of the remaining buildings. There were empty control rooms, peeling paint, and a few rusted filing cabinets. In one corner, I found an old cot and some empty cans. Someone had slept here, maybe a squatter, maybe decades ago. I didn't stay long. The wind picked up and gave the place a strange, hollow sound, like voices far away, though I knew it was just the buildings moaning in the wind. I headed back down to the cabin. That night, I sat on the porch and listened. The trees rustled. I heard something move through the underbrush once or twice. Probably deer. I tried not to let the silence get to me. It was what I came here for, after all. I read a bit by flashlight, then went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Something had changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, like something was just outside. At one point, I sat up in bed and thought I heard footsteps. But when I looked out the window, I didn't see anything. Just black trees and the pale outline of the clearing. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went back to the radar site, this time with my camera. I walked through the same buildings, but I took my time, looking into every room. In one of them, I found something that hadn't been there the day before. It was a red can of baked beans. New, clean label, no dust. It was sitting on a broken desk, right in the center. I stared at it for a long time. Then I left. That night, I locked the door. I kept the fire going longer, and I stayed up later than usual, pretending to read while I listened. A few times, I thought I heard something scrape against the walls. I told myself it was a branch. I told myself I was being paranoid. But I didn't sleep until the fire burned out and the cold drove me under the covers. When I woke up the next morning, the cabin door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. The wind couldn't have done it. I had locked it, turned the bolt, checked it twice. I felt a thick pressure in my chest as I walked over and pushed it shut again. I didn't see any footprints outside. Nothing looked touched, but something had been here. Something had turned the lock and opened the door. I grabbed the axe I kept by the firewood pile and set it by the bed. I didn't go to the radar site that day. I stayed at the cabin. I kept the generator running and stayed in the light. I cooked, read, and tried to stay calm. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to seem crazy. Maybe it was just something I'd forgotten. Maybe I hadn't locked the door as well as I thought. That night, I heard it again. Footsteps, not walking exactly, more like slow crunches through the frozen leaves. They circled the cabin. I sat on the bed holding the axe, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, then started again on the other side of the cabin. Something brushed against the wall, then silence. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found a trail. Someone or something had walked around the cabin. The snow was light, but fresh enough to hold shallow prints. Not shoes, not boots, bare feet, naked, pale footprints circling my cabin. My mouth went dry. The tracks didn't come from the path. They came from the woods, from deeper in. I packed that day. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. That night, the power went out. I went outside and checked the generator. The cord had been cut, not chewed, not frayed, clean. A single slice like it had been done with a blade. That was it. I packed everything I could in under 5 minutes. I didn't wait for daylight. I grabbed the axe, got in the truck, and drove. Fast, headlights bouncing off the trees, tires skidding on frozen dirt. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove straight through the night and didn't feel safe until I hit paved roads and saw streetlights again. When I got home, I tried to forget. I deleted the photos. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even go back to the forum where I found the listing. I just buried the whole thing deep in the part of my mind that handles things we don't talk about. But a few weeks later, I got a package. No return address, no note. Inside was a can of baked beans. The same brand, same red label, still no dust. I never went near the woods again. I had always loved the idea of getting away from everything. The constant buzz of city life, the endless distractions, the noise. It was all too much for me. I wanted to experience something simpler, something more peaceful. That's why I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization. I found the place online. A small, rustic cabin in the mountains, nestled in a secluded area. The photos promised quiet nights, fresh air, and a chance to truly disconnect. The moment I saw it, I knew I had to go. The drive was long and winding. I passed through small towns, then forests, and finally the last stretch of road became almost impassable, barely wide enough for my car. I had to navigate tight turns and uneven terrain. It wasn't a particularly comfortable ride, but the thought of what awaited me at the end kept my spirits high. The scenery was stunning. The trees, the rocks, the smell of pine in the air. This was exactly what I needed. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood just as I had imagined it. It was small but charming, with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked a thick forest. The setting sun cast long shadows over the land, giving the cabin a warm, golden hue. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. This was my retreat, my escape from everything. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bags from the car. The key was waiting for me in the usual spot, hidden under a loose stone by the door. Inside, the cabin was cozy, furnished with an old wooden table, a fireplace, a couple of worn chairs, and a single bedroom with a large bed covered in plaid blankets. It was all simple but welcoming. I lit the fireplace and unpacked, trying to settle in. The first thing I did was open a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. I wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight seemed like the right time. The cabin didn't have electricity, but it was equipped with oil lamps that cast a soft glow throughout the space. I opened a book and settled into one of the chairs, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. It felt good to be away from everything, away from the noise, the obligations. For a moment, I felt at peace. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the wind howling outside, louder now, like a wild animal prowling in the dark. It was strange, though there was something different about it, something almost unnatural. But I chalked it up to the isolation of the place. The way sounds seemed to carry differently in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sleep eventually came, but it wasn't restful. I dreamt of the woods outside the cabin. Dark, oppressive trees, twisting shapes moving between the trunks. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding, and sat up in bed. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. I sat there for a few moments trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't spent much time alone in such a remote place before. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the area. The sun was out, and the air was crisp but not too cold. I ventured down a small path that led deeper into the woods. It was beautiful. Trees towering above, birds singing, the ground soft with moss and pine needles. I walked for a couple of hours, taking in the solitude, the peace. But the further I went, the more I started to feel watched. I couldn't explain it. It was like there were eyes on me, always just out of sight. I stopped for a moment, looking around. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of any other human presence. But something didn't sit right. There were no animals, no signs of life other than the birds. It was too quiet. Even the trees seemed still, like they were holding their breath. I continued on, trying to push the feeling aside. I came across a small creek, its water running fast and clear. I knelt down and took a drink, then sat on a large rock, letting my mind wander. The strange feeling of being watched persisted, but I couldn't figure out what was causing it. There were no other hikers, no cabins nearby. It was just me, the trees, and the creek. But still, something was off. After a while, I turned back and made my way toward the cabin. The walk back felt longer, the shadows creeping across the trail as the sun began to set. By the time I reached the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the familiar surroundings put my mind at ease again. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and settled in for the night. That night, the feeling of unease returned. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But when I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the image of those dark trees from my dream. I heard the wind pick up again, but this time, it wasn't just the wind. There were sounds, distant, faint, like footsteps crunching in the underbrush. It sent a chill down my spine. I listened, heart racing. The sounds were coming closer, then stopping, then moving again. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. They were just walking, as if they knew I could hear them. The footsteps came closer and closer until they stopped altogether. Silence. I waited, straining my ears. I reached for the lamp and stood up, moving to the window. Outside, the world was pitch black, the only light coming from the flickering oil lamp inside the cabin. There was no one out there, no sign of movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I turned off the lamp and crept to the door, peering through the small crack in the frame. Nothing, just the dark, empty woods. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just the isolation. I told myself that I would be fine, that I had nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, sleep eluded me again. I stayed awake, listening to the wind and the occasional creaks of the cabin. Hours passed, and the sounds from the woods seemed to grow more frequent. I began to wonder if I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I wasn't alone out there. The next morning, I decided to head into town. I needed supplies anyway, food, water, maybe a change of scenery. It was a long drive, but it would take my mind off things. I packed up and left, locking the door behind me. The roads were as empty as they had been the day before, and the drive to the small town felt oddly peaceful. I spent a couple of hours there, picking up supplies, chatting with a few locals. I mentioned to one of them that I was staying in the cabin in the woods, and they gave me a strange look. "You should be careful out there," the man said, his tone suddenly serious. "Those woods are old. Some say they have a mind of their own." I laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But something about his words stuck with me as I drove back to the cabin. The feeling of being watched had returned, and now it was even stronger. It was as if the woods themselves were waiting for something or someone. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. At first, I thought I had forgotten to close it properly, but when I stepped inside, I realized it had been opened from the inside. I hadn't left it that way. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the cabin carefully. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt different, heavier, like it had been disturbed. I locked the door and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was wrong. Something or someone had been in the cabin while I was gone. As I lay in bed that night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept hearing sounds outside the cabin, rustling, footsteps, even something that sounded like breathing. I could feel my pulse quickening. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I'd been planning to get away from the city for a while. Everything had started to blur together: work, traffic, noise. Even weekends felt like just another part of the same gray routine. I lived in a small apartment near downtown, close to the noise of trains, sirens, and people yelling in the street at all hours. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't peaceful. I hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. I found the cabin through a rental site that people use for short vacations. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place on a hill surrounded by woods. There was a gravel road that led up to it. No neighbors in sight, no real signs of anything modern except a few solar panels on the roof and a cell tower you could see far off on another ridge. The listing promised silence, nature, and solitude. That was all I wanted. I packed light, just clothes, a few books, food for a week, and some tools in case something broke. I planned to stay 6 nights. The owner sent me a code for the lockbox by the door and a warning to bring everything I needed ahead of time because the nearest town was over an hour away. That didn't bother me. In fact, I liked the idea. The farther I was from people, the better. I drove up on a Wednesday morning. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on a winding road with potholes and tree roots pushing up through the gravel. No signs, no fences, just woods on both sides. I passed an old mailbox with no numbers on it, leaning to one side, and a rusted trailer that looked like it hadn't moved in a decade. Other than that, nothing. Just the sound of my tires crunching gravel and the wind shaking the leaves. When I got to the cabin, I parked off to the side in a small dirt clearing. The place was smaller than I expected, more like a shack, but it was clean and solid. Wood planks, metal roof, a narrow porch with 2 old chairs, and a small fire pit out front. The trees were thick and tall, casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cool, piney air. Felt good, quiet, still. Inside it was simple. One room, a small kitchen along the back wall, a table and 2 chairs, a twin-sized bed, and a cast iron stove. There was a narrow bathroom built into one corner with just a toilet and a sink. No shower. The water came from a tank that I had to refill from a hand pump outside. No internet, no TV. Just a few books on a shelf and a battery-powered radio. It was exactly what I wanted. That first day was calm. I unpacked, swept the floor, and walked a few trails that led away from the cabin. Most didn't go far before vanishing into thicker brush. I found a rocky outcrop where I could sit and look down into a deep, forested valley. No houses, no roads, not even the sound of a plane overhead. Just wind and birds and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. That night, I fell asleep fast. The silence was so complete it almost had weight to it. No honking, no yelling, just the creak of the cabin settling and the soft hum of wind in the trees. I slept better than I had in months. But the second night, something changed. It started with a sound outside the cabin. It wasn't loud, just soft crunching, like someone or something walking slowly across dry leaves. I sat up in bed and listened. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. There were no big predators in that part of the state, or so I'd read. I stayed still, listening, but after a while the sound faded. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and checked the area around the cabin. I expected to see hoof prints or maybe animal tracks, but the ground was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd heard hadn't been a normal animal. The steps had been too slow, too deliberate. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I brushed it off and went about my day. That afternoon, I hiked again. I brought a small hatchet with me this time, just for peace of mind. I followed the longest trail I'd found so far, one that climbed steadily uphill before leveling off near a ring of boulders. From there, I could see across to another ridge and down into the valley. The view was incredible. I stayed there until the light started to change, then made my way back to the cabin. As I walked, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't hear anything, but the woods suddenly felt different. Too quiet. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering, just still air and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I picked up my pace without meaning to. That night, I didn't sleep well. The sounds started again just after midnight. This time, they were closer. Crunch, pause, crunch. It circled the cabin slowly, one step at a time. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't locked the door with the deadbolt. I got up quietly and did it, trying not to make any noise. The steps stopped for a long time. Then a new sound would creaking, like the porch boards bending under weight. I stood by the bed, frozen. The window didn't have a curtain, and the moonlight lit up the inside just enough that I could see my own shadow. I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before climbing back into bed. I didn't sleep. I just lay there waiting. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no marks, nothing moved. But something had been there. I was sure of it now. I walked to the edge of the woods and looked out across the trees. There were no signs of anyone, but it didn't feel right anymore. I spent most of that day close to the cabin. I kept the axe nearby and didn't go on any trails. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound in the woods made me look up. That sense of peace I'd felt on the first day was gone. The stillness now felt threatening, like the forest was watching me. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table with the lights off and the axe in my lap. I listened. Around 1 a.m., the sounds came again. Steps in the leaves. This time, they stopped behind the cabin. I stood slowly and moved toward the back window, but I didn't see anything. The steps started again, moving toward the side of the cabin where the water pump was. Then silence. Suddenly, a loud thunk. Metal on wood. I jumped and looked outside. Still nothing. I waited, barely breathing. Another thunk. This time I knew where it came from. The pump handle. It was being moved. Not a raccoon. Not wind. Someone was out there. I moved away from the window back toward the bed. I considered grabbing my keys and just driving away. But the road out of there was narrow and rough, and if someone was trying to scare me, they might be blocking it. I waited until sunrise again. As soon as it was light, I packed my stuff into the car and drove toward the road. My heart was racing the whole time. Every turn I expected to see something. Another car, a tree across the road, a person, but there was nothing. I made it down the hill and back onto the main road. I didn't go home though. I drove into the nearest town, just a few shops and a diner, and stopped at the gas station. I told the clerk someone had been around my cabin at night. He looked at me for a long time, then said he wasn't surprised. Said there had been people living off the grid in those woods for decades. Not the kind of people who liked visitors. He told me not to go back alone. I didn't. I called the owner of the cabin from a payphone and told him I left early. I didn't explain. I didn't ask for a refund. I just said thanks and hung up. I didn't sleep for days after that. Even in my apartment, with the city noise outside, I kept waking up and checking the windows. Weeks later, I looked up the area where the cabin was. There were stories, old ones, about missing hikers, strange sightings, people who went into the woods and never came out. Most were brushed off as legends, but one article stood out. It mentioned an abandoned hunting camp deep in the forest near where I'd stayed. Authorities had found signs of people squatting there, handmade traps, food wrappers, piles of clothes, even a few rusted weapons. They said the people living there were probably long gone. I don't think they are, and I don't think I was supposed to find that cabin empty, but I did, and I think whoever or whatever was watching me from those woods wanted it back. I never told anyone the full story, not because I'm scared they won't believe me, but because I'm scared they will. I haven't been camping since. I haven't even left the city. I keep my windows locked and check the door twice before bed. Every time I hear a soft sound outside, I remember that slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves, and I wonder if they followed me. That's all I kept telling myself when I accepted my friend Matt's offer to stay at his family's cabin for a week. I'd been dealing with too much work, bills, problems at home, a million little things piling up on me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. I wasn't sleeping right. I kept snapping at people. My chest felt tight all the time, like something was crushing me from the inside out. I knew I had to go somewhere quiet, where there were no phones, no screens, no noise, just trees, air, and time. Matt had mentioned his family's cabin to me a few times over the years. It was old, built by his grandfather back in the 60s. One of those plain wooden places with a porch out front and a wood stove inside. It was up in the northern part of the state, about 3 hours out, deep into the forested hills. No neighbors for miles. No cell service. Just dirt roads and pine trees. When I told him I needed to clear my head, he offered it to me without hesitation. He said he hadn't been up there in a couple years, but it should still be stocked with the basics: blankets, cookware, firewood, even a small generator if I needed power. He left me the key and a hand-drawn map. I packed up a few days' worth of groceries, threw everything into my SUV, and left early in the morning. The drive was peaceful at first. Music off, windows down, just the sound of tires on pavement and the occasional bird call when I pulled off to stretch. After the last small town, the road narrowed into gravel and then dirt. I followed the hand-drawn map, squinting at turns and markers, until I reached a rusted metal gate with no lock. The chain had been wrapped around it loosely, just to keep it from swinging. I pushed it open, got back in the SUV, and followed the overgrown trail that passed for a driveway. When I saw the cabin, something in me finally started to unwind. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine and fir trees, tall and thick, packed tight enough that almost no sunlight came through. The cabin was simple, just one story, weathered with siding, a front porch with a broken swing on one side. The roof sagged a bit, and the window shutters were a little crooked, but it looked strong. There were chopped logs stacked beside the porch and a rusted axe leaning against the wall. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine and dirt and moss, the kind of smell that never reaches the city. Inside was just as plain. One main room with a wood stove, an old couch, a coffee table, and a kitchenette against the far wall. A hallway led to a small bedroom and a bathroom. Everything smelled like old wood and dust. There was a cupboard with dry goods, beans, rice, soup cans, even some powdered milk. A cooler sat under the counter. The bathroom had a composting toilet and a bucket shower setup. There was no plumbing, but a blue barrel outside collected rainwater. I unpacked, made a small fire in the stove to warm the place up, and sat on the couch with a can of beans. For the first time in months, my thoughts slowed down. I went to bed early, wrapped in heavy blankets, the fire crackling a few feet away. The silence was unreal. No cars, no planes, just whined through the trees. It took me a couple of days to really settle into the quiet. I'd wake up around 7, make oatmeal on the propane stove, then sit on the porch with a mug of instant coffee and just listen. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I walked around the woods behind the cabin, following old game trails or just exploring. I brought a folding knife and a compass, just in case, and stuck close to the cabin at first. There was a stream maybe half a mile downhill, shallow and cold, with smooth rocks underfoot. I'd go there to rinse off or just sit for a while. The days blurred together in a good way. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was breathing again. But around the fourth day, something changed. It started with a sound. I was out walking the trail behind the cabin, a little deeper than usual. I'd packed some jerky and water in a small bag and planned to loop back after an hour or two. The forest was dense. Thick trunks, ferns everywhere, patches of moss soft underfoot. It was quiet, too quiet, even for a remote place like this. I hadn't seen a single deer or squirrel all day. No birds either. That felt off. Then I heard it. A snapping branch. Close. I froze. It wasn't the kind of snap you make by stepping on a twig. It was loud, something heavy. I waited, holding my breath. Another crack, then silence. I slowly turned and scanned the woods. My eyes jumped from tree to tree, shadow to shadow. Nothing moved, but the feeling in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I took a step back, then another, trying not to make any sound. My skin prickled. I turned and walked quickly, trying to stay calm. Every few steps, I looked back. Still nothing. But I didn't shake the feeling all the way back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door and slid the bolt across. I sat on the couch with the fire going and tried to brush it off. Probably a deer, I told myself. Or a bear. Maybe even a tree branch falling. But the feeling stayed in my chest. Tight, cold. The next morning, I found boot prints. I was walking around the cabin with my mug of coffee, checking the rain barrel, when I saw them. In the dirt near the back wall, just a few feet from the bedroom window, boot prints. Not mine. Mine had deep treads. These were wider, flatter. Old work boots or something like that. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, then disappeared behind a tree line to the north. I stared at them for a long time. Someone had been here. While I was sleeping, I felt something slide down my spine, a kind of hollow, cold dread. I looked around the woods, scanning the trees, the shadows. There was no movement, no sound. I spent the rest of the day with my knife clipped to my belt. I didn't go on any walks. I stacked more firewood beside the door, checked every window, every bolt, every lock. That night, I moved the couch against the door and slept with the knife under my pillow. The next day, I found something worse. It was early morning, and I walked down to the stream to fill my water bottles. I followed the same trail I'd taken before, moving slowly, eyes scanning everything. The sun was just coming up, weak light filtering through the trees. I reached the stream, bent down, and saw something stuck in the rocks a few feet away. A shirt, not mine. It was dirty, ripped in places, soaked halfway in the water. I pulled it free and held it up. It was a flannel shirt, torn at the sleeves, stained with something dark, maybe old blood. The collar was ripped clean through, like someone had pulled on it hard. My stomach dropped. I turned and ran. Back at the cabin, I stuffed the shirt into a trash bag and tossed it inside the metal drum beside the porch. I didn't know what else to do with it. I kept pacing, thinking. Someone had been here, watching, close enough to lose a shirt, maybe injured, maybe hiding. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside felt louder than before. I sat in the dark with the fire down low, just enough light to see the door. My ears strained for footsteps, for breathing, for anything. I clutched the knife and didn't move for hours. At some point, I must have nodded off because I woke up to the sound of gravel shifting. Outside, I sat up, heart pounding. Then a tap, soft, against the window. I didn't move. Another tap, then nothing. I didn't go to the window. I didn't go outside. I sat there in the dark, knife tight in my hand, chest heaving. When the sun came up, I finally moved. I opened the door slowly. The air was still, the forest quiet. But I saw the prints again, same boots, same direction. Circling the cabin, stopping right at the window. I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast. Shoved food, clothes, supplies into bags. I left the firewood, the blankets, even my book behind. I just wanted out. I got in the SUV and started the engine. Gravel kicked up behind me as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the gate. And that's when I saw it. The chain. It was locked, tightly wound, sealed with a rusted padlock that hadn't been there before. I hadn't locked the gate when I arrived. There was no reason to, but now it was shut and there was no key. I stared at it in disbelief. My hands started to shake. I got out, looked around, tried to tug the chain free, but it wouldn't budge. The padlock was solid. I turned to the woods. Whoever had been there, they'd locked me in. My only choice was to drive back to the cabin. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I tried something desperate. I got out the old axe and started swinging at the chain. It didn't do much. I tried the wooden gatepost instead, chopped at it until my arms burned. After hours of work, I finally cracked it enough to pull the chain free and push the gate open just wide enough to squeeze the SUV through. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached a gas station with cell service. I called the police and told them everything. I showed them the shirt, the prints, the chain, everything. They promised to send someone out. A week later, they called. I needed to get away for a while. Everything back home was getting to be too much. Work deadlines, city noise, people everywhere. I felt like I was always tired, always irritated, and I hadn't slept properly in weeks. I told myself I needed solitude, some time with no phone signal, no people and no distractions. Just trees, cold air, silence. So I booked a small off-grid cabin in the mountains, one that I found through a listing site for remote rentals. The owner didn't ask too many questions, just gave me a code for the lockbox and told me there was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no running water, just a solar panel, a fireplace, and a rain barrel out back. The cabin was about 4 hours north of where I lived. A rough drive once I turned off the main road. The last stretch was a long dirt path twisting through the woods. No signs, no gates, nothing but trees and tire ruts. By the time I got there, it was mid-afternoon. Sunlight was breaking through the trees in long streaks, the forest looking calm and empty. I parked off to the side of the cabin, stepped out, and just stood there for a minute. It was quiet. I mean, dead quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of my own boots crunching on dry needles. The cabin was small, just a single-room structure with a little porch, a pitched roof, and wood stacked neatly beside the steps. Inside, there was a cot, a wood stove, a small table with a chair, and a shelf holding a lantern, some books, and a few old cooking pans. I dropped my bag on the cot, opened the tiny fridge powered by the solar battery, and shoved in the things I brought. Some water, eggs, cheese, a couple of apples, and a few canned meals. The first evening passed quietly. I built a small fire in the stove, lit the lantern, and sat reading a paperback I brought. Every now and then, I looked up at the single window across the room, the one above the little counter near the sink. Nothing but trees out there, shadows moving as the light faded. I went to bed early, wrapped in a sleeping bag, the fire burning low behind the stove's glass door. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No car horns, no glowing screens, just the slow creak of wood and the quiet snap of fire. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. My back was stiff from the cot, and the inside of the cabin was cold. I stepped out onto the porch, shivering a little, and took a piss off to the side. The forest around me was still dark, but I could see light creeping up behind the trees. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp earth. I went back in, made some coffee on the small propane burner, and sat outside drinking it with my coat zipped to my chin. That was when I noticed something weird. About 30 feet from the cabin, just off the tree line, there was a small dark shape sitting at the base of a pine. I squinted at it for a minute, thinking maybe it was just a stump or some shadow, but something about it felt out of place. I walked out into the cold grass, boots wet with dew, and stopped a few feet away. It was a trail camera, one of those motion-activated wildlife cameras hunters or researchers use. It was strapped to the tree with a black bungee cord, the lens pointing right at the cabin. Not at the front door, not at the woods, right at the window. I stood there for a long time, not moving, just looking at it. It wasn't hidden or anything. It was mounted at chest height, easy to see. The kind of thing someone wouldn't leave by accident. The little red dot on it told me it was still running. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing else. Just tall trees, old leaves, the sky getting lighter above them. I don't know why, but I didn't touch it. I just turned around and walked back to the cabin, hands in my pockets, trying to act like it didn't bother me. I told myself it was probably just the owner keeping an eye on the property, maybe to catch vandals or squatters. But the camera wasn't aimed at the trail or the firewood or anything you'd expect. It was fixed on that window, the only one in the cabin. And that night, when I lay in bed with the fire burning low and the woods outside black as ink, I couldn't stop looking at the window. I hadn't noticed it before, but there weren't any curtains. Nothing to block the view. From out there, someone could see everything inside. Me sitting, me changing clothes, me sleeping. The third day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for more cameras. I didn't find any, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I'd stop walking, stand still, and stare into the trees. Nothing. But the feeling was like a pressure, like being studied from a distance. That night, I moved the cot to the far wall and built the fire hotter than usual. I sat in the corner with my knees pulled up, the book in my lap unread, just staring at the window, watching for movement. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of red light out there, just for a second, like the LED on the trail camera. It was gone as fast as I saw it, and I told myself it was probably just my eyes playing tricks. I kept the lantern on all night. The next morning, I snapped. I went out there with a screwdriver and yanked the camera off the tree. The little plastic bracket cracked in my hands, and the camera came off clean. I took it back inside and sat at the table with it, just staring at it. No brand name, no labels, just black plastic with a dirty lens and a slot for an SD card. I didn't have a laptop or anything with me, so I couldn't check what was on it. I stuffed it into my backpack and zipped it shut. After that, I couldn't relax. I'd planned to stay a full week, but by day 4, I started packing my stuff. I told myself I'd just leave a day early, head home, forget about it. But the next morning, when I went outside to start the car, my tires were flat. All 4, not slashed, not punctured, just flat, like someone had slowly let the air out. I checked the valve stems. They were loose. I tightened them back up, but I had no pump, no spare, nothing to get the car moving again. That was when I realized I was stuck. No phone signal, no internet, no people for miles. I didn't even pass another cabin or campsite on the way in. I looked back at the trees and thought about walking out, but I had no map, and the path was long. Too long to walk in one day, and if someone had come in during the night to mess with my tires, what else were they willing to do? I spent the rest of that day inside, doors locked, listening to the woods. I barely ate. I barely moved. Every sound made me freeze. A branch cracking, wind rustling leaves. Each one could be footsteps. Every now and then, I peeked through the boards of the window, trying not to be seen. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the fire low, the cold creeping in through the floorboards. I held the hatchet I found on the porch when I arrived, the one meant for splitting kindling. I held it tight in my lap and stared at the door. At one point, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something moving outside. Soft, slow footsteps on the porch boards. Then silence. I waited, muscles locked, every breath shallow. Then the door handle turned. Not rattled, not forced, just a slow, deliberate turn. Locked. It didn't open. Whoever it was stood there for a while. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat in the dark, watching the door, listening to my own heartbeat in my ears. After maybe a minute, the footsteps moved away. I didn't hear them walk off. They just stopped. I stayed in that spot until the sun rose. When light finally started to fill the room, I unlocked the door and stepped outside, axe still in my hand. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had come in the night. I walked the trail back toward the main road, hoping to find signal or maybe flag someone down. But I didn't see a single soul. No tire tracks either. Whoever was out here wasn't coming in on the same road I had. I made a decision. I would walk all the way out if I had to. I packed up my bag, stuffed it with food and water, and slung it over my back. Before I left, I opened the trail camera and took the SD card. I didn't know why. I just felt like it might matter, like someone should see it. I started walking that morning, taking the trail slow and careful, listening the whole way. The woods stayed quiet, not peaceful, just silent in a heavy way, like everything was holding its breath. I made it nearly halfway to the main road before I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, car engine. Slow, steady, following the same trail. I stepped off the path into the trees, crouched behind a fallen log, and waited. After a few minutes, a black SUV rolled by. No plates, windows tinted. It moved slowly, like the driver was looking for something, or someone. Passed, and I stayed hidden for nearly an hour after that, barely breathing. When I finally made it to the road, the sun was already low. I flagged down a pickup after maybe another hour of walking. The driver didn't ask questions, just let me ride in the bed all the way to the nearest town. Once I got there, I went straight to a gas station, charged my phone, and called a friend to pick me up. Later, when I got home, I checked the SD card. There were hundreds of files, photos and short video clips. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and the forest. A break from the noise, the stress, and the constant buzz of city life. I had found this little cabin tucked away in the woods, far from civilization, on a website that promised solitude and comfort. It seemed perfect for a quiet retreat. I drove for hours, following winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. As the city faded behind me, the trees started to crowd in, the air becoming thicker and heavier with the scent of pine. The road eventually turned into a narrow dirt path, and after another half hour of jostling around in my car, I finally arrived. The cabin was small but charming. It had a wooden exterior, weathered by time but sturdy enough. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, keys in hand. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was greeted by a musty smell, the scent of old wood and dust. I didn't mind it. It added to the rustic feel. There was no electricity, just a few gas lamps scattered around the place, the kind of cabin you'd expect to find in old adventure movies. The kitchen was small but functional, a single stove, a fridge, and some cabinets. In the living room was a stone fireplace, the hearth empty and cold. The only other piece of furniture was a leather couch, worn from years of use. I dumped my bags on the floor and took a moment to absorb the stillness of the place. The trees outside swayed in the wind, and there was a faint rustle of leaves. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing in front of the cabin. Perfect evening, I thought. A cup of coffee and a book by the fire, that's all I needed. But then, as the night closed in, things started to feel off. It wasn't the isolation or the silence. Those were things I had been craving. It was something else, a slight unease that I couldn't shake. It was as if I wasn't alone, even though I was. I shrugged it off as just nerves. After all, I had driven all the way out here for some peace and quiet, not to let my imagination get the best of me. I set up a fire in the hearth and opened the small fridge to grab some food. As the fire crackled to life, I ate in silence, the only sound the occasional pop from the burning wood. The night crept in deeper, the air turning colder, and still, I couldn't quite shake that nagging feeling. I went to bed early, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on me. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not from a noise, but from an odd sense of discomfort. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I couldn't quite place what was wrong. The room was pitch black, and all I could hear was the faint crackling of the fire that had burned down to embers. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the battery was dead. I cursed under my breath. Of course, the one thing I forgot to charge. I rolled over and glanced at the window, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was far too large to be an animal, and it was too close to the cabin. I froze, staring at the shadow outside the window, barely breathing. The shadow didn't move again, not for what felt like forever. I told myself I was imagining things. It had to be the trees. The wind had picked up, and the branches could easily cast strange shapes in the night. But the longer I stared, the more real it seemed. The shadow was too defined, too deliberate. It wasn't the wind. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was someone else who had wandered off the trail. Maybe they were just passing through, looking for shelter. I didn't know what to think, but the unease continued to gnaw at me. I decided to get up and check. I quietly crept out of bed and made my way to the window. The room was so dark that I couldn't see anything but vague shapes. My hand trembled as I pushed the curtains aside just enough to get a better view. Outside, the shadow was gone, but that didn't bring me any peace. Instead, it made the air feel heavier, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. I stepped back from the window and sat on the bed, my mind racing. Should I check the front door? Should I go outside? The cabin didn't have a lock on the back, just a simple deadbolt on the front. It was a small, rustic place not meant to keep people out. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself that would be ridiculous. I couldn't just let my fear dictate my actions. It was probably nothing. I laid back down, but sleep wouldn't come. The feeling of being watched lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. My eyes kept darting toward the window, but nothing was there. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my nerves, and I drifted off again. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight pouring through the small gaps in the curtains. The feeling of unease had faded, but there was a new tension in the air. The calm of the previous day was gone, replaced by something more ominous. I got up and dressed, trying to shake off the strange night. Outside, the woods were quiet, save for the birds calling in the distance. The forest seemed almost too still. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The cabin stood alone in the clearing, the trees encircling it like silent sentinels. I breathed in deeply, but the air didn't feel as fresh as it had the day before. It felt heavier now, and I couldn't put my finger on why. I spent the day in and around the cabin, trying to keep myself busy. I went for a walk down a nearby trail, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. But even the woods felt wrong. The trees seemed too dense, and the path felt as though it went on forever. I didn't want to go too far, so I turned back after an hour, but the tension never left. The woods felt oppressive, as though they were closing in around me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints outside just beyond the porch. Large, heavy ones, as if someone had been standing there for a while. I wasn't sure how to react. I thought about calling the number on the website, asking if anyone else was staying nearby, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I locked the door and spent the rest of the evening inside, the unease never fully leaving me. That night, I slept with the curtains drawn tight, the flashlight next to me on the nightstand. I don't know why I thought that would help, but I needed something to make me feel secure. I woke up several times, each time to the feeling of being watched. Each time, I'd stare at the window, expecting to see that shadow again, but nothing ever appeared. The forest remained still and silent. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a break from the city, from everything that had been dragging me down. The cabin I had rented was in a remote area, a couple of hours from the nearest town. It seemed like the perfect place to escape, to get away from people, and to just spend some time in nature. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the air fresh and cool with a hint of pine from the surrounding forest. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was narrow, winding around hills and through thick trees. As I got closer, the only sounds were the crunching of my tires on the road and the distant chirping of birds. No other vehicles in sight. I was alone here, just how I liked it. The cabin itself was small but cozy, nestled between tall trees, with a porch that wrapped around the front. It had a wooden exterior, dark with age but well maintained. The roof had patches of moss growing in places, and the windows were small, but they let in enough light. It was perfect. I unloaded my car, feeling the weight of the week's stress slowly lifting as I carried my things inside. The inside was just as charming as the outside, with wooden beams across the ceiling and a stone fireplace in the living room. The floors were creaky but solid, and there was a small kitchen to the right. A staircase led up to the second floor, where the bedroom was. I set up my things, made a simple meal, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, the quietness of the place grew more pronounced. The kind of silence you don't get in the city, the kind that feels like it's pressing in on you. At first, I found it peaceful, but as the shadows grew deeper outside, I started to feel an unease I couldn't shake. The wind picked up a little, and the trees began to creak and sway. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Footsteps, maybe just on the edge of hearing, like someone was walking outside. But when I looked, there was nothing, just the dark forest, stretching endlessly around me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just letting my mind get the best of me. After all, I was alone in the woods. The idea of a cabin in the middle of nowhere is supposed to feel unsettling, right? That's part of the charm, the sense of isolation. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would calm my nerves. The bed was comfortable, the covers warm, and I fell asleep fairly quickly. But I woke up in the middle of the night. It was one of those jolting awakenings where you're not sure what woke you up. The room was dark, too dark, and the silence was thick. I lay still, listening. There it was again, the sound of footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there. My heart started racing. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. That was part of the charm of getting away from everything. No distractions, no connection to the world. I lay there waiting. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the walls of the cabin. My eyes darted to the window. I couldn't see anything through the darkness outside, but the trees were moving more than usual, swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the house settling. But that rational thought didn't make the fear go away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like I was being watched. I didn't dare get out of bed at first. I stayed under the covers, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Animals, a passing hiker, maybe even a lost camper who had wandered too far off the trail. I told myself it was something harmless, something explainable. But then I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, the unmistakable sound of something or someone walking around the cabin. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. No one was supposed to be here. I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed. The air felt cold as I pulled on my jacket and stepped into the living room. The house was as quiet as ever now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked to the front door and looked out through the small window in the doorframe. Nothing, just the darkness of the forest stretching out into nothingness. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. I could see my breath in the air. The forest was still and silent, but there was something about the way the trees moved, too erratically. It wasn't the wind. It felt unnatural, like the forest was alive with something I couldn't see. I stood there for a long time trying to calm my racing thoughts. But the more I stood there, the more I started to hear things. Twigs snapping in the woods, branches moving, the soft rustle of leaves. Something was definitely out there. I debated going back inside and locking the door, but a part of me needed to know. Was it an animal? Was there someone else here? I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and walked toward the edge of the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense forest. It was so quiet now that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a flash of movement in the shadows. It was quick, but it was there, something big moving between the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, my pulse pounding in my ears. I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted it. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my chest felt tight and my mind was racing. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside. But nothing happened. The footsteps stopped. The sounds in the woods stopped. By morning, I felt like a fool. The sun was up, the world was calm, and I had been too paranoid. I had to convince myself that what I thought I saw, was just a trick of the light. There was no one out there. But then, as I stepped outside to check the area around the cabin, I saw something strange. The ground near the edge of the woods was disturbed. There were footprints, big ones too. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. The tracks led into the woods, deeper than I would have liked. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't alone here after all. I didn't wait around to figure out who or what was out there. I packed my things as quickly as I could and left the cabin behind. I drove out of the area, not looking back. As I made my way down the winding road, I finally felt a little bit of relief. But as I turned a bend, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. I don't usually go out of my way to do things like this. I'm not what people would call outdoorsy or adventurous. But that month had been hard, and I needed to get away. City life was closing in on me, and everything started to feel like it was too loud, too fast, too much. I had just quit my job. Not because I had something better lined up, but because I just couldn't take the pressure anymore. I thought if I didn't stop everything for a while, something inside me was going to snap. So I started looking for a place to disappear for a week or two. Not a hotel, not a tourist trap, just somewhere far away, somewhere quiet. That's how I found the listing. It wasn't on any of the major rental platforms. It was a single-page website, just a few photos, a PayPal link for payment, and a short paragraph describing the place. Remote off-grid cabin for rent, surrounded by forest, no neighbors, no noise, no interruptions. That sounded exactly like what I needed. The price was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but I didn't think too hard about that. I figured it was just a private owner who didn't want to deal with corporate booking sites. The photos were basic. A small wooden cabin, single story, a wood-burning stove, a twin bed, a kitchen sink with a hand pump, and a folding table with a single chair. There was a small outhouse out back. The rest of the photos showed dense woods all around, a gravel trail, and a stack of firewood by the door. I wasn't expecting luxury. I wanted isolation. That's what this place promised. I booked 5 nights and wired the money. The site gave me GPS coordinates and a short message that just said, "Keys under the step." Took me almost 6 hours to get there. The first 4 were on paved roads that gave way to a single-lane highway, which turned into a winding dirt road that disappeared into the trees. No cell signal for the last 2 hours. I kept checking my phone and seeing no service. Eventually, I stopped checking. didn't matter. I had the coordinates saved to an offline map. I found the narrow pull-off where the trail started. It wasn't even marked. Just a break in the trees and a gravel path that disappeared into thick woods. I left my car at the base of the trail and threw my pack on my back. Everything I needed was in there: some dried food, canned stuff, a few tools, a flashlight, a battery bank, a knife, matches, a first aid kit, and a small solar panel for charging. I also had a book and a small notebook. I wasn't planning on doing much besides sitting, thinking, and trying to relax. It took maybe 20 minutes to reach the cabin. The trail wound slowly uphill and curved around a large boulder, then leveled out into a small clearing. The cabin looked just like the photos. Square, weathered, and simple. It had one small window on the front and a rusted stovepipe sticking out of the roof. The firewood was still there, neatly stacked. I walked up to the step and reached underneath. The key was right where they said it would be. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dust. The place hadn't been used in a while. I opened the window to let some air in and looked around. Everything was exactly how it had looked in the pictures. Bare and functional. The only surprise was a small coat hanging on a hook by the door, old, brown, and worn, like it had been there a long time. I assumed the owner had left it. I unpacked slowly, putting my food in the cupboard and setting up the sleeping bag on the bed. I boiled some water on the wood stove, made tea, and sat in the chair by the window as the light started to fade. The quiet was perfect. No traffic, no voices, no buzz of electronics. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of branches shifting in the woods. That night, I fell asleep almost instantly. The first 2 days were uneventful. I walked around the woods a little, but didn't go far. I didn't want to get lost. I read a bit, wrote some things in my notebook, and sat outside on a flat rock behind the cabin, just watching the wind move through the trees. The only signs of wildlife were squirrels, birds, and a couple of deer that came close to the clearing early in the morning. I chopped a little firewood and made a small fire in the stove each night. Everything felt still. It was exactly what I had hoped for. But on the third night, things started to change. It started with the feeling that someone had been inside. I had gone out to the woods that afternoon, just far enough to lose sight of the cabin for a little while. I came back before sunset, like I always did, and noticed the cabin door wasn't fully closed. It was just barely ajar, maybe an inch. I was sure I had pulled it shut. There was no wind strong enough to open it. Still, I convinced myself I must have forgotten to latch it. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place at first, but when I looked closer, I noticed the chair had been moved. I always left it by the window facing outside. Now it was pulled away slightly and turned toward the wall. It wasn't much, but it felt wrong. I checked the cupboards. My food was still there. The knife was still on the shelf. Everything was there, but something had shifted. I felt it in my chest. That night, I locked the door and pushed the chair against it. I kept my flashlight in my hand and slept in my clothes. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, but there, just outside the window, in the soft patch of dirt where the firewood ended. The prints were bare, no shoes, just the outline of toes and the ball of a foot pressed lightly into the soil. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin and then disappeared back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of them. Maybe they were old. Maybe they had always been there, and I just hadn't noticed. But that didn't feel right. I would have seen them before. I walked the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything. No movement, no sound. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see from where. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside with the door locked and the window shut. I only opened it once to toss out the bucket of wash water I'd used for cleaning dishes. The forest was still and heavy. Even the birds seemed quieter. When night came, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the light to give away my position. I sat in the dark, trying not to breathe too loudly, listening to every creak of the walls and every groan of the trees. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a slow crunch in the leaves, then another, soft, spaced apart. Not an animal. Too slow, too careful. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight with the batteries already in it, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside the wall, near the window. I couldn't see anything. The glass was too dark, the moon too dim. I held my breath for what felt like forever. Then the sound started again, moving away this time, back into the woods. The branches rustled softly as they moved. Then nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, stuffing everything into my pack without folding or organizing. I kept looking out the window every few seconds. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling hadn't left me. Something was out there. I stepped outside and walked fast toward the trail. The air was still. I could hear the crunch of my boots on gravel like gunshots. I hadn't gone more than 50 feet when I heard it. A sound from behind me, a thump, like a door closing. I turned around. The cabin door was shut. I had left it open when I came out. I knew I had. My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at it, not moving. My hands started to shake. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked faster. I reached the bend in the trail and looked back one more time. There was someone in the window, just a shadow. No face, no movement, but a shape was there. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I saw my car at the bottom of the trail. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for almost 10 minutes, breathing hard and watching the trees. I didn't see anyone come out. I didn't hear anything. I started the engine and drove. Fast. I didn't care about the suspension or the dirt road. I just wanted out. It wasn't until I hit the highway 2 hours later that I started to calm down. Cell service came back. I didn't check my messages. I didn't call anyone. I just drove. I slept in a cheap motel that night, locked the door, pushed a chair against it, left the lights on. The next morning, I opened my phone and went to the site where I booked the cabin. It was gone. Not offline, gone. The domain wasn't even registered anymore. I tried searching for the photos using reverse image search. Nothing. It was like the whole thing had never existed. I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. They listened, but there wasn't much they could do. It was private land, not an official rental. No names, no records, no way to track who had been living there. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't follow up. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not alone. Not far from roads. I don't rent cabins online. I booked the cabin 2 weeks before my trip. It was supposed to be a break from work. I was burnt out. My job was demanding and my days were mostly screens and meetings and barely any sleep. So I looked online for something isolated, away from the city, away from everything. The listing caught my eye because it was cheap, in the middle of a forest in northern Montana, and the pictures showed nothing but trees all around. The ad said it was a secluded off-grid experience for those who want total quiet. That's exactly what I thought I needed. The cabin was about 5 hours from the airport. I drove a rental SUV stocked with food, water, and gear for the week. I didn't plan to hike or fish. I just wanted to be alone. The drive got more and more rural the farther I went. Paved roads turned to gravel. Cell service faded to nothing. I passed the last small town about 2 hours from the cabin, and after that it was nothing but trees and dirt roads. The directions said to look for a metal sign nailed to a pine tree. It had the number 181 carved into it. I nearly missed it. I backed up when I saw it, then took the narrow path that veered off to the right. It was rough going, but the SUV could handle it. The road looked more like a trail. Branches scratched the sides of the vehicle. I had to stop once to move a fallen limb. I didn't see a single car, house, or even a fence the entire way in. I was deep in it, exactly like I wanted. I finally pulled up to the cabin around 3 in the afternoon. It was smaller than it looked in the photos. A single-story wood structure with a sagging roof and a porch that tilted to one side. There were no power lines, no driveway, just a small clearing with dead leaves and old stumps. I parked close and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected for late spring. The wind pushed through the trees in slow, steady waves. The key was supposed to be under a loose stone near the door. I found it easily. The front door creaked loud when I opened it, but everything seemed fine inside, basic but clean. One bed, a table, a couple of chairs, a wood stove, and a kitchenette with an old pump sink. No electricity, no plumbing except a compost toilet out back. There was a propane lantern, some canned food, a hatchet, a broom, nothing more. I unloaded my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, then started a small fire in the stove. I didn't feel like doing anything else. I just sat there in silence. First, it was peaceful. I listened to the wind, the crackle of the fire, the soft groan of the wood walls when the breeze picked up. I ate some trail mix, drank bottled water, and tried to relax. That night, I went to bed early. It was the kind of dark I hadn't seen in years. No light from street lamps or electronics. When I turned off the lantern, I couldn't see my own hand. I heard noises outside, branches snapping, small things moving in the leaves, but I told myself it was animals. Probably deer, maybe raccoons. I slept okay, but not deeply. The second day, I went for a short walk around the area. I didn't go far. I didn't want to get lost. The trees were so thick and tall that I lost sight of the cabin after a few minutes, so I stuck close and turned back early. I spent most of the day reading, writing in a notebook, and sitting on the porch. I didn't see or hear anything unusual. The forest was quiet, but that night something changed. I woke up around 1 in the morning. I wasn't sure why. The fire had gone out. The room was cold. At first, I thought it was just that, but then I realized I heard something. It was faint, but it was out there. A sound like metal. Not loud, not steady. It would stop, then come back again. It was too irregular to be wind or animals. It was like someone dragging something across the ground. I sat up in bed and listened hard. The noise stopped. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. I got up slowly and lit the lantern. The cabin glowed in a soft orange light. I didn't open the door. I just stood there for a while, watching the shadows move on the walls. I didn't hear anything else that night. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. I saw tracks, not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin. They came in from the trees on the south side, walked around the porch, and stopped near the back corner of the cabin. Then they disappeared again into the forest. I looked closer. They were fresh. The ground was soft from the rain the night before. No other prints, just one set. I followed them a little ways, but they led into the woods, and I didn't want to get too far from the cabin. I felt sick to my stomach. Someone had been here during the night, watching the cabin, maybe watching me. I stayed close to the door that day. I didn't read. I didn't eat much. I kept the lantern full, the hatchet close. I kept thinking about how far I was from everything. No phone service, no neighbors. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the idea of driving out at night scared me more. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter, maybe someone passing through. It was remote, but people wandered into places like this sometimes. That night, I stayed up. I kept the lantern lit. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer. The dragging sound. It moved slowly across the leaves. Then it stopped. Then it started again. My heart was pounding. I stood there with the lantern in one hand, the hatchet in the other. I moved to the window. I didn't open it. I just peeked through a crack in the curtain. There was someone out there. I saw the shape move between the trees. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. He was dragging something behind him, but I couldn't see what it was. It looked heavy. He stopped about 30 feet from the cabin, just stood there. Then he walked out of view. I didn't sleep at all. The man never came closer, at least not that I could tell. I watched the windows until daylight. When the sun came up, I went outside and looked again. More boot prints, fresh again. I followed them this time farther than before. They led about 100 yards into the woods. Then I saw it. Tarp, gray, stained, bunched up near the base of a tree. I moved slowly. I don't know why I didn't run, but I had to know. I got close and nudged the edge with the hatchet. A leg fell out. It was a man's leg. Pale, stiff, the foot still in a boot. I staggered back and nearly threw up. I didn't check the rest of the tarp. I turned and ran back to the cabin. I locked the door. I packed everything. I left the firewood, the canned food, all of it. I started the SUV and drove out as fast as I could. The branches scraped the sides again. I didn't care. I didn't stop. Not until I hit pavement. I made it to the nearest town by mid-morning. I found a diner, told the first person I saw to call the police. They came fast. I told them everything. They drove out to the cabin with me. I didn't want to go back, but I did. When we got there, the tarp was gone. The prints were gone too. The only ones there were mine and the cops. They searched the woods for hours. Dogs, ATVs, even a helicopter. They didn't find anything. No body, no tarp, nothing. Just an old cabin in the woods. I gave a statement. They took my info, said they'd keep in touch. But nothing ever came of it. I checked for news for weeks after I got home. Nothing. No missing persons. No bodies found. No arrests. I never went back to the woods. I sold everything related to that trip. Gave away the camping gear. Deleted the cabin listing. I don't know who that man was or what he was doing or what happened to the body. I don't want to know. All I know is that something very bad happened out there and I was too close to it. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but when I hear a sound outside at night or when I see trees swaying in the dark, I remember the dragging sound, the shape in the woods, the boot sticking out from under the tarp. I went out there to be alone. I didn't think about what else might be out there, but someone was, and they didn't want to be seen. And I know I only got out because I left when I did. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here now. I should never have rented that cabin. I was burned out. That was the truth behind it all. The kind of tired that coffee doesn't fix. It wasn't just work. It was everything. Too much noise, too many people, too much pressure all the time. I was waking up more exhausted than when I went to sleep. Every little thing annoyed me. Even the city's hum felt like it was crawling under my skin. I needed to get away. So when I found that listing for a small off-grid cabin in the mountains, I booked it without thinking too much. It wasn't fancy. Just one picture on the site. A wooden box tucked between trees, some dirt trail leading up to it, and a short line that read, * no Wi-Fi, no electricity, just silence. * that sounded like heaven to me. I packed my truck with canned food, a water filter, a sleeping bag, some books, a couple knives, and a rifle just in case. I told one friend where I was going and when I'd be back, then turned off my phone and drove north. The first part of the drive was smooth. Highways, towns, gas stations. But after I got onto the Forest Service road, it got rough. Potholes, branches scraping the sides of the truck, rocks bouncing off the undercarriage. It took almost an hour to drive the last 6 miles. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was dipping low and the trees were casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was smaller than I thought, but solid. Rough timber walls, a tin roof, a little front porch with an old rocking chair, and a stone chimney on one side. No lights, of course, just a padlock on the front door and a small woodshed behind it. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and shut the door behind me. The air inside smelled of old wood and dust. There was one window, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few supplies, and a narrow bed with a wool blanket folded at the foot. No running water, but a rain barrel outside and an outhouse a few dozen yards into the trees. I lit a candle, sat down at the table, and let the silence soak into me. No emails, no notifications, just the wind outside and my heartbeat settling into a slower rhythm. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. The first few days were perfect. I woke up with the sun, chopped wood, walked the trails, cooked over a fire, read until the light faded, then sat on the porch until the stars came out. There were birds in the morning and crickets at night. I could hear the wind in the pines, the crack of branches as deer passed through, the low groan of the trees shifting in the dark. I didn't see another soul, and that was just how I liked it. But on the 4th night, something changed. I woke up just after midnight. I don't know what made me open my eyes. There was no sound, not at first. Just that stillness that feels wrong somehow, like the world is holding its breath. Then I heard it. A single, sharp knock on the side of the cabin. Not the door, the wall. I sat up, heart suddenly racing. I didn't move right away, just listened. A few seconds passed. Nothing. Then another knock, same spot. Not hard, not loud, but clear. Could have been a branch falling, or a deer brushing up against the wall. But I hadn't heard any footsteps. No crunching leaves or snapping twigs. Just two isolated knocks and then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, the rifle across my lap. When morning came, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of anything or anyone. I told myself it was nothing. Wind, trees, animals. But that feeling never left. That day, I didn't stray far from the cabin. Every little noise had my head turning. I kept thinking I saw something between the trees, but every time I looked, there was nothing, just shadows and light. When the sun went down, I bolted the door and lit 2 candles instead of 1. I slept with the rifle next to me again. And again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was something dragging across the porch. Slow, rough, like someone pulling a stick across the boards. It started from one end and went all the way to the other, then stopped. I didn't breathe. I just listened, gripping the rifle so tight my fingers cramped. Then it happened again. A slow, dragging scrape, then silence. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door and stepped outside. There were fresh marks on the porch. Long scratches in the wood. Not claw marks, too wide. Not boots, no prints. Just deep, uneven lines like someone had dragged a metal pipe or a broken branch across it. But again, no other signs. No footprints in the dirt. No broken twigs. Nothing. I should have left that day. I thought about it, packed my things, threw them in the truck, and just got out. But I didn't. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I came out here to get away from stress, not run from it. So I stayed. I told myself I'd wait one more night, just one. That was a mistake. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the table, candle burning low, rifle leaning against my leg. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the trees and moaning against the corners of the cabin. I was starting to drift when something hit the back wall. Hard. Then again. A heavy, solid thump. Then another. 3 hits in total. Then silence. I stood up slowly, heart hammering, and moved toward the back window. The candle flickered behind me, throwing my shadow across the wall. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see through the darkness. Nothing. Then a shape moved, just for a second. A flicker of motion between the trees. Person. They were standing just at the edge of the clearing. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know it was no animal. No hat. No light. Just a still figure in the dark. I didn't sleep. I sat with the rifle all night, staring out the window, not blinking. Every time the wind shifted, I imagined I saw them again. But they didn't come closer, didn't move, just stood there. When the sky turned gray with morning, I finally opened the door and stepped out. They were gone. I went down to the edge of the trees. No footprints, no broken branches. But I knew what I saw. That was it for me. I packed everything I could, locked the cabin, and got in the truck. But the road out was rough. And about a mile down, I came around a bend and slammed on the brakes. Someone had blocked the road. Branches, rocks, a full tree trunk laid across it. It hadn't been there on the way in. Someone had done this. Recently, I got out and cleared what I could, heart racing, eyes darting to the trees. It took almost 40 minutes to move enough to drive around it. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, or to see that shape again. But nothing happened. Once I was past it, I drove like hell. Didn't stop until I hit the first small town with cell service. I called my friend, told him I was fine, but didn't say much else. I drove straight home, locked all my doors, and sat on the couch for hours, just staring at the wall. That was 6 months ago. I didn't tell anyone what really happened. I didn't go to the cops. What would I say? There was no proof, no pictures, no injuries, just a feeling that something out there watched me, something that wanted me to leave and made sure I did. But I think about it every night. The way the knocks started soft, the dragging sound, the figure at the tree line, the roadblock, that wasn't random. Someone was out there, and they didn't want company. I haven't gone back. I won't. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the wind starts to howl, I swear I hear that sound again. That slow, scraping drag. And I remember the way the porch creaked under weight that wasn't mine. And I remember how I used to think being alone in the woods was peaceful. Now I know better. Sometimes it's not the animals you should be afraid of. It's the people who choose to live where no one else goes. The ones who don't want to be found. The ones who don't want you to leave. And the ones who make sure you never come back.